I just want to welcome everyone and thank you so much for joining us today. It's a really exciting culmination to this 1 year study for these students. And I think that one of the discussions that we would all like to engage in is also how these projects might enter the world. So not only seeing this as a kind of terminal point in the education, but where might this start to be implemented outside of the school, and whether each student, I think, has a different trajectory outlined, and specifically in Emiliano's case, this is taking the shape of a workshop that will be implemented. And so I think some discussion of that would really be fantastic to have. And as David said, this is part of the curriculum. This is called the studio portion, where students are formulating their pedagogical position in the format of a studio brief for an advanced studio in a school of architecture. In some cases, in Emiliano's case as well, this touches on issues, urban issues. So again, the question of where might this plug into a faculty, what kind of institution that might be, or is that a consulting role? I mean, all these things I think I would love to hear some discussion on. Also, the students have been studying the history of design pedagogy with Gary Fox of architectural pedagogy, and our other faculty are here, Michael Osman, who I believe David introduced. I'm not sure if you were on at that point, Michael, but so the students also have seminars which are called design labs with these faculty, and Matt Shaw, I believe, is here too. And so the discussion is constantly sort of taking the form of both a conceptual, theoretical sort of problem statement and speculation on answers to some of those problems, but also through the design work. So that's very important to us, that there is also a kind of concrete production working with technologies, that I think is a big discussion as well. So welcome everyone, and I guess with that, we'll hand over to Emiliano.
Oh, before we begin, just a quick, I already sent as much information as I could gather about each of you, because I always find it tedious at the beginning of these things where like 30 minutes are spent just introducing the people in the room. You know? So I welcome you to go and just go through the links I sent on everybody. But as I mentioned,
David, hi, it's John Rassant here. I'm here, but I can't seem to get my my picture up on the screen. But I'm
okay, no
listening
problem,
attentively.
Okay.
Nice to see you.
We can start with you, John. John Rassant is the founder and chairman of New Cities Foundation, and you were the organizer of the Davos conferences before that, weren't you?
Yeah, for quite a few years, I was responsible for producing.
And you've been sponsoring these conferences in Los Angeles and in other cities on the future of mobility.
Yes.
And so I thought it would be perfect to have you here for Emiliano's presentation. Amanda Burden needs no introduction, but she's somebody I knew from the newspapers when I was living in New York, when she was the planning commissioner for a decade, maybe a little bit more than a decade. But she's principal of Bloomberg Associates now, and it's a real pleasure to have you here, Amanda. Paul Nakazawa, I've been known more through emails and texts for a long time, but Paul is associate professor at Harvard GSD, but I encourage all of our students to get to understand what kind of person Paul Nakazawa is, because he's a tremendous influence on those practices that you have heard of. And I think he's an absolute genius in strategy and architectural strategy and the development of forms of practice. So the CV is quite long, so please click the link and get to know Paul. Then we have Andres Bortagare. I'm sorry, my pronunciation is horrible, but I have asked Emiliano and the other students to invite people too. So we've never met Andres, but maybe Emiliano, you could say a few words about Andres because the invitation came from you.
Well, Andres is a specialized and expert in mobility and urban studies. He was also candidate for mayor of Buenos Aires City in 2016, I think. And it's a really pleasure and a very kind to have you here also.
Thanks a lot for inviting. Good to join you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. So then we have the faculty of the Design Theory and Pedagogy program, and Marcelin Gao is the head of the program. Then I'm going to scan the grid here because I get confused too. We have Gary Fox, who teaches the fall seminar, and Gary curated a very interesting show about the Bauhaus at the Getty. And he worked with the students in looking at the history of architectural education in the 20th century. And we have Gary's mentor here, Michael Osman, very mafia-like, you know. But Michael is the director of the PhD program and co-conspirator at UCLA. Then we have Yara Fagali and where's Claudia? Claudia Weiner is here somewhere in the grid. Yara and Claudia will be the incoming faculty of the fall design studio of this program. Anthony Mori is here. He's the director of the A+D Museum here in Los Angeles. And he and Yara and Claudia is filling in for Anthony. Hopefully we'll have you back at some point, Anthony, or maybe they'll do a good job and you won't be back. I don't know, we'll see. But Anthony has taught the students in the fall studio this past year. Matt Shaw teaches the seminar this summer. He was the executive editor of Architects newspaper, but now he's an independent journalist and most recently started writing for that little paper in New York called the New York Times. So great to have you here too. I think I've covered most everybody. I made the mistake of inviting as many people as I can because we're on Zoom now. And I thought that could be a benefit of this new weird reality we have. So forgive me if I get a little confused about certain things.
I think you need to introduce Masha.
Yeah. Oh, Masha. Masha Hupalo, did you finish your dissertation now? Oh, you're muted. Well, anyway, she was imminently about to defend her PhD. Oh, good. Congratulations. At Aarhus University in Denmark, and she's been with us throughout the year. She works in a research department, and she's been spearheading a lot of urban research projects we've been doing, including the development of a ballot measure here in Los Angeles, which has been a very interesting project for SCI-Arc. And then the pandemic hit, and then that ground to a halt. But hopefully we'll pick up all these adventures once at some point in the future. So with that, Emiliano, I'm gonna hand the floor over to you.
Okay.
And yeah, I think I said enough. Okay, so thank you.
Okay, thank you, David. Right. Okay, do you see my screen? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I want to take this opportunity to have this enormous, prestigious jury to debate the role of the public space in the central areas of the mid-sized cities, especially. I was born and raised in Buenos Aires, a world-class urban metropolis, and I came to Los Angeles to do this program because Los Angeles was an urban world-class city. But when the pandemic came up, a dilemma arose for me, what to do. In this chaotic time, middle of March, a relative offered me a place to stay with a good condition for my family, my kids, and to have more space than my little apartment in downtown LA. That location was Boise, Idaho. And the story begins in that moment. So the research first studied city with the United States with more than 50,000 residents, called it American City, which provide information about population and density, how these two aspects and how these two aspects interact. The data obtained show that most of the city had between 1 and 500,000 residents, like kind of a mid-size scale. In 1956, in the United States, began the construction of the interstate highway system, a network to control the access highway that would connect each state, and more importantly, to intend to decentralize the major urban centers. As a consequence of that, a great group of cities appeared, the mid-sized American cities. There are 317 cities above 50,000 residents in the United States. 10 have more than 1 million residents, 27 have over 500,000 residents, and 280 have a population between 100 and 500 residents. Is almost the 90% of the city of the United States. And those are the cities that have an estimation to grow by roughly the 10% in the last year. The pandemic in this moment showed the vulnerability of large urban centers, posing health, mobility problems, and socioeconomic inequality, which confirmed that big cities could not continue growing the way that they are doing. Large companies located much in major metropolitan area give employees the possibility to work from home permanently. This condition brings a new reality, where a great advantage for workers who now do not need to live close to their workplace, but can live in any city they want with a better quality of life. In this new normal, mid-sized cities now could become the opportunity to become something very important in the idea of the cities. And as in the middle of the 20th century, the reason for the migration was the Cold War and this kind of decentralization of the city. Today, maybe the pandemic, the terrorism, the climate change, and maybe in a good way, a good quality of life is the reason of that change and that migration. Enrico Moretti, the author of the new Geography of Jobs, says the high demand for a skilled talent in core cluster had led to creation of emerging innovation center outside the traditional markets such as Silicon Valley, New York, Seattle, and Boston. While it might not be possible to become the next Silicon Valley overnight, there is a long list of cities that are making an important contribution to the growth of their local economy by supporting and welcoming high technology companies, startups, and expansion centers for larger tech companies. And Boise is one of them. Boise in the map, just only if someone didn't know, is kind of that city that is in the middle of the west part of the nation. And it has, of course, a little hub cluster of innovation and high tech. Micron is one of the biggest companies that here. HP comes first, and Simplot is a bio technology that is working with food and supplies. This is really amazing, the map that 2 days ago or 3 days ago came from New York Times with the colors of the country, and I see Boise there, and Boise is a lightly blue like dot in this kind of amazing red environment. Boise is a city that has a river, the Boise River, and the river plays an important role in the city, where it's a consistent and beautiful green belt has passed on along the neighborhood to it, and it's very important for the community. Just to put something in place, a side comment, the historic Georgian colonial residence that we are seeing right now is on the market and is $2 million the price. And just in front of that house, also nearby the downtown area of the Boise city, has this kind of mid-century city also. frame, the booming in real estate here is amazing. And since I came here in March until now, always that I'm follow and seeing in terms of real estate, always is evolving, and the market, the housing in the market during like this pandemic wasn't hit at all in terms of what's going on. So I'm talking about mid-sized city. Now I'm going to talk a little bit of downtown Boise. That is the area that I'm going to make the case study. Downtown Boise has a relatively lower density than its population, and the data show that almost 50% of its empty spaces are parking, while its public space is neglected and does not encourage people to walk, gather, or stay. Cars tend to become the protagonists of the city, occupying most of its area. It's not something particular of Boise. This kind of city has that kind of problem, but it has a sophisticated urban structure. On one hand, it has great historical buildings. Downtown is a combination of nature, cultural, institutional, and historic heritage, and mixed-use structure with a unique characteristic. On the other hand, countless voids and new development without any identity. That is something that you can see not only in Boise, but it's something that happens always. And also in one hand, you have like this kind of experiment that are closing some street, but the street that is the city hall there is almost all of the street is for cars, and neither one space of that street is for pedestrian. Another kind of interesting thing, the Capitol is a monumental building. It's very beautiful and powerful. And in front of this important, beautiful building, there is a parking structure. So now I'm going to jump a little bit to explain the post-public concept. The post-public concept has three different modules, and the last is kind of the general idea. Post-public space is about active forms, machine landscape, mobility and innovation with autonomous system, community, the role of public and private policies, and the superground. That is the idea that I wanted to take a little bit more in shape. Active form, machine landscape. We are going to live in a public space that is going to be controlled not only for human and by human, by machines, and the machines are going to play a role within them. So we can have this kind of conversation. The little lady in the middle is talking with a drone, and the drone says that she needs to put a mask, and so we are going to deal with this kind of technology, this kind of new forms of interaction. When we talk about mobility, we talk about the things that are going to happen in the future, but in a way, before the pandemic, we was in the transition state. The streets are no longer the thing that we think. We have here John Rosan, that is the author of the book Hop, Skip, and Go, talking about the innovation in that regards, and the space is going to be controlled by robotic units and night deliveries, and maybe the things are going to come on not only for ground, for air also. And we have a lot of experience and products that are already on the market, and it's going to change a lot the way that we already understand the city. So what happened with the street, or what happened with the public space in this moment? The second or the third part of the post-public concept is about community. It's about public policy, private policy, and the combination of both two. During the last part of the 20th century, these two books, Gale and Jacobs, make a point of reclaim the street again for people, and I think it was quite a very good role that the new type of urbanism play. But I think right now we are dealing with another issue that we need to address. Now here the first two examples that are is about car infrastructure landscape, and the last one is the renovation that take place in New York 10 years ago. So 6 months ago, we have this kind of environment and landscape, and in 2 months in advance, we became to have this kind of different scenario. Here we have the picture of the light camps of Milano, Madrid, New York, Los Angeles, Rio de Janeiro, and Buenos Aires, and this kind of amazing new forms of dealing with the public space. So I wanted to talk about this kind of the concept of the super ground. No, this kind of three things, the active form, the mobility, and the community engagement. I think it leads to understand what happened with the street or with this kind of the ground. And I want, if we compare the street or the public space with a food dish problem, I think we can find a quite interesting concept. If we take the street as a food dish problem, in the first case, we divide the street or the plate of the dish, no, the food. You can eat only one of the three ingredients in the first case, if we divide. In the second case, we share. And if we share, you can get only the part of the three ingredients that are assigned to you. And this is a good case, but also it's not the big one, because if I wanted to make that thing, I think the third case is kind of the super ground or the super dish, when you blend and you take what you want. So what if we make that analogy with the streets, no? Here we have the street as we know, of course, with cycles, with pedestrians, with space for people. And what if we take all the dynamics forms of the street, and we have all the passive, okay, and we can get out all the cars of the street, no? So we have more space in the street for pedestrian maybe. And now what if we take out everything that is the evidence that cars are allowed to, or are only the ones that are allowed to play there? So we have like kind of a very like different situation. And what if we have this kind of super ground? And if this super ground is something that is evolving, in this super ground, all the three concepts can be applied: the mobility, the active forms, and the community engagement. So in that kind of thing, I think it's kind of the evolution of the proximity city theory, that is kind of the 15-minute city. I think the 30-second city, when you have something to do or something to interact or something to play, this kind of 30 seconds, these central areas could be replaced and become much more like engagement. For last, back in Boise, post-public is not only as a place where human and system are now the protagonists, but also a place where different scenarios could occur. This concept will allow the opportunity to combine private and public sector, providing a better space for residents by giving economic responses to private developers and the administration authorities better public policies. So this is the idea, no? I take one of the main street of Boise. This is Idaho and Capitol Boulevard. And what if we apply the super ground here, and we understand that the city could be, this ground could be the voice of the people, could be a place for sports events, could be an urban farm moment, could be for recreational activities, could be for entertainment. So this shared ground could be, in a way or another, a new space where the meaning of the public space is changing and shifting. So with that sense, how is the public space we are going to live? That's the question that I think. Thank you.
Emiliano, before we open it up for discussion, and I just do want to mention it's not really meant to be a review, but we could just have a kind of seminar here where we can all just think this through together. But Emiliano, one thing I think I would like you to mention is the research you've been doing throughout the year. It doesn't map very well into how we define the design studio in schools of architecture. So could you say a few words about some of the things you and I have been discussing about how to build your academic career moving forward? Like what kind of formats are you looking towards or wanting advice on in how to continue this line of thought in academia and what's available?
Well, I think I'm interested in a way to understand what could be the next step of future of the space in urban areas, no? And that's, in my case, is one of the things that I always be interested in the last, I think, 10 years. And that's why I maybe in a conceptual way, I'm much more feeling comfortable with the idea of what's happened in the space where different action can occur, and yeah, and that's it.
Yeah, I guess
think
my question's more specific than that, Emiliano, because design studio is a kind of semester-based thing, and the faculty member will research and then put a design prompt, and then we get 12 student projects looking at it. But a lot of these kinds of problems, they're like multi-year things and very complex and require some engagement with and with people working in public service. And schools generally aren't very well set up for this. We have urban research institutes in various schools of architecture, but generally they tend to become their own funny silos, where they have their own research that tends to be often disconnected, from other advocacies, So I think think tanks or policy institutes, I think, generally are better equipped, to form this kind of nexus between advocacies and interests and engage politics of the city also. So I think what we've discussed is you might need to go venture out a little bit and rethink the model of this form of academic work. And we might need to invent some new formats so that things like this can be pursued in a multi-year, ongoing manner.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, well, the conversation is not about like only the academic field. I think we talk about a lot in this kind of triangle of the public sector, the private, and the developed conversation, the developer conversation that never like maybe is attached with this kind of trilogy in the academic, the public, and the private. So I think in a way I wanted to address that in kind of the project. Also, of course, the project is based on like a Boise, but I make the things happen in Boise because I quite feel very interested in the city. I was coming here with a lot of I don't know, preconception about it, and then I realized that the city has a lot of potential, and I believe that this kind of potential is something that is also in many of this kind of type of city.
Emiliano was a practicing architect in Buenos Aires, and he was also a journalist. And you won some kind of award for a TV show you did in Argentina, didn't you? This summer or something like that. And yeah. I think he came to this program in search for a different model of practice and academic research. So I think I just wanted to steer our this discussion, which I'm now going to open up, to just for all of us, I guess, to also speculate about what might be missing as a format in education.
Yeah, thinking through the idea of formats, Emiliano, it's been great to see the development of your work over this past year and the development of your research specifically. The thing that I struggle with, I guess, if we're thinking the design of a studio brief, is where does your research end and where does the student's research begin? I know that we've talked about in multiple seminars in multiple contexts, the kind of contemporary pedagogical pressure to think through the relationship between student and pedagogue, and in particular to give agency to the student in that process of exchange. So I wonder, how can you accommodate a student, for example, who would argue that this vision of the future of the urban is a kind of dystopian reality that kind of encodes certain forms of socioeconomic disenfranchisement, or other forms of critique in the design of the studio brief itself?
Yeah, well, Gary, thank you for the comment. I think in my case, I believe that I replaced the idea of the studio in this kind of three different stages of modules of pedagogy stages. Like one of these talking about perhaps public space in terms of mobility, and that kind of module applies by tools, by technology, but also by like history and ideas of how you became like something in that regard. And I think in the same way, I feel that the other part is about community and this kind of relationship between the private and the public, and the last one is about the role of the machines in the society. So I'm not like making I think a linear classic or like a classic studio format. I believe that in my case I part the project and idea in three different kind of stages. And in this project in particular, I was like trying to make a case in that city, and I think maybe that is something that maybe turn a little bit the looks or the eyes of the project itself. But I think the idea of this kind of post-public in terms of three things, that is the thing that I'm talking about the pedagogy.
I wonder if maybe Claudia and Yara, the two of you might want to comment on this particular issue, because both of you are graduates of this program and you're both now teaching. Claudia is at Cal Poly Pomona and Yara is at UCLA. And you know, this question of what part of the research is yours and which is the students, and I guess also which belongs to the institute. And I think there is some question of intellectual property here in the background, but also the intentions of the education too. It's never entirely made clear, I think, in architectural education.
Yeah, I would say that I think the project is super interesting. And as you said, David, before, like it's a project that has been going on for a while. So I would say I am still waiting for you to like explain the format of what the studio would take. I think that if one thing I would be curious to know is like, are you planning to base it on case studies? So when you were presenting, I thought, you know, of a walk down Market Street in the 90s, that old black and white movie. I thought about the Hanoi intersection in Vietnam. I thought about so many different examples of Mumbai where you have this very complex mobility and these, you know, layers of, these examples that you could really learn from. Instead of posing it as something new, you would pose it as something that exists and learning from that and then adding technology to that. So I saw it more as a maybe urban case study where you would have a traveling studio and each student would have a case study and try to understand these old ways that are actually more efficient than the spatial division that we have, which you showed perfectly with your broccoli, eggs, and bacon.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was also thinking about it a little bit differently, because to David's point earlier, I mean, there's a lot that you're trying to unpack, and so then you have to ask, what is the objective, right? what do you want students to get out of this? What's the outcome, right? Literally in a syllabi, there's the learning outcome, the learning objective. So you're kind of projecting what the students, what you see the students are going to learn from researching this topic. What I find more interesting about the potential of this research isn't in that you would see this as a typical design outcome as we commonly, normally see it in studio where they would be designing objects. Instead, that they would be more engaged in policy and code and city ordinances, so that you would actually take them to town hall meetings and actually engage with the city rather than always kind of looking at it objectively. It would become much more about community engagement. And I think that that's something that I'm missing in your research, is that aspect of public space. Historically, who has claimed public space? If you think about Los Angeles or probably any city, there is, you've kind of touched on it a little bit for political acts, but there's also people who don't have homes, right? Who have to then acquire public space. So I think those are questions for me that I want to challenge you, but also you should challenge the students to kind of look at, these topics in that context, especially now, right? Like all of these problems are even more exacerbated because of the pandemic.
Emiliano, could I make a suggestion? If you could unshare the screen for a while so we can see everyone, and maybe it feels more like a seminar format. I think I was a bit surprised by the way you presented this today, because I know that we had discussed multiple times the possibility of this taking the form of a workshop. And the way it was presented today, in terms of knowledge production, it was almost as if you, as the sole author, have defined the problem, the scope of investigation, and almost already have the solution. And I think that's kind of disturbing in a way, because I would expect that this would be something that you would need to work through with a number of people and consultants and specialists in different areas. And even thinking about the tools, because I know at some point you had said there might be a gaming environment where you set up assets, urban assets, and you start to play out scenarios within that game board. And so that didn't really come into the presentation today, which I missed a bit, because I think that was a very powerful idea. And I'm just wondering, could you talk a little bit maybe about why that wasn't presented, or if that's still the plan?
Yeah, well, it's still the plan. If this take the idea of the workshop, of the seminar, or the 3 seminars that are related together, the idea of working in that kind of game environment, AI and other tools that are applied to the project, to use for the project, I think is something that is coming. Today, I was shifting to have a kind of a case of a study to show and to build the narrative or discourse about the importance of this kind of mid-sized cities. I think that is another thing that I wanted to discuss. That's why maybe I take a little bit size of the idea of show the structure of the workshop and the structure of the tools and the methods and the skills that you are going to gain on the workshop. But now I wanted to kind of present a roughly idea of what if I take this street and a student work there, a kind of in a very, of course, compact way.
But I think that the tools and the techniques are part of the argument and the position. So I would just say going forward, that can't be left out. Like that is so important, how you set up the framing of a problem. And when you do research, if it's really research, of course you begin with a hypothesis. You might also have some bias that you don't even realize until you begin to do the research. And as you do it, you sometimes discover that your initial hypothesis was incorrect. And the research swerves sometimes and the question swerves. But so I think that it's just so important that those techniques and the format and that setup needs to be considered.
Emiliano, I think one of the things that confused me was that you've conflated the intellectual framework for how you transform the city landscape versus the focusing on a very specific instance of mid-sized cities. So in reality, if you look at the capital stack, if you look at technology stacks, and you look at policy and policy frameworks and how the institutional framework sets up cities for change, then it's easier to investigate the dynamics between the forces that then allow you to navigate it into a kind of a physical transformation. But I agree with Marcelin that you have to start with that intellectual scaffolding as processes in order to get to the specificity of of a mid-sized city or a place or something else. So in a way, I think if you're going to turn it into an academic program, you need to work on the you need your deck first of processes and frameworks that will allow you then to deploy them in different instances. So it wouldn't necessarily be a street. It wouldn't necessarily be a mid-sized city. It could be Times Square.
Of course.
So I mean, the urbanism so unless we can talk about the mechanisms of getting from point A to point B, you wind up with a quote design, or an idea of a place. Then it starts being like an iron magnet for all these kind of criticisms of why you can't do that.
Emiliano, if I could, so your setup was so interesting. All the different elements that are changing about public space and taking over some streets for people instead of cars, and automation. But I didn't quite get what your point of view was and your objective. Like Claudia said, what is the outcome that you want to see that with all of these changes? And of course, your main title is public space. This is for public. This means for people. And you set this up by talking about Boise, which, like many downtowns of mid-sized cities, which is so interesting, and mid-sized cities could never have anything like Times Square because you don't have that energy and density. You have much lighter density. So how in a mid-sized city where you don't have that many people, do you create public space in combination with automation, fewer cars, less parking garages? Where does the public fit in? And a little indication in this, because you've set up everything very well, but not quite clearly where you want to go. Should these mid-sized cities be more for people, and they will include automation and they will include street sharing or whatever, but it wasn't quite sure where you wanted to go and how landscape fit in, but in how, especially how people fit in, and how you not only attract people to these places, but get them to stay. That's the real problem with mid-city downtowns, is they're handed over to cars, but people don't want to stay in them. And I think if you're going to go back to your title, which is public space, what is just to convey what's your objective and what are all of the issues you've laid out for getting there? Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and Amanda maybe wasn't clear in the presentation, but my message and my idea is that public space need to be, or had to be, something positive in a way. I need to reconvert, taking an account that is technology going on, that is automatization going on, and this. But my message is, that is a city that could be held that. Of course, not in the same way that maybe in Times Square or in New York or in the big cities, you have this kind of energy, power, and engagement. But the idea of, if you have like a central area that is tied and it's compact, you can apply some kind of moves to get in there and to respect and to potentially like make it much more better, no?
Exactly, if it's tight and complex. What you did show were many blank canvases, which look scary. But if you have the complexity and the tightness, then you have the energy. And that, but you didn't quite show that. You showed big capturing of the street, but it looked really scary.
Yeah. Well, I had to say that the downtown Boise has this kind of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This kind of, they're really nice and beautiful, like buildings that are like 100 years ago, and you can get a beer there or a coffee there. But in some way, you cross the street and you have this kind of new development with anything about public space and anything about the relation with this kind of thing. But that kind of thing, that I think that is a problem. But that I think is the thing that I wanted to expose. I don't know if I could.
Good.
I want to return. Sorry, go ahead, John.
Sorry, just one quick comment, and that is, I think for me, what's actually so interesting about your work, Emiliano, is precisely that it is focused on Boise, Idaho. Now, the population of Boise, Idaho is 250,000, more or less, 250,000. I mean, it's not even a neighborhood of New York City or Los Angeles, where I live now. So, so often the themes that you're talking about, new mobility, public spaces, etc., it's always people in New York and Los Angeles and Paris and London talking about that, and it's relative for megacities like that. As you pointed out in your introduction, most people, in fact, majority of the world's population is urban, but a majority of those urbanites live in cities that are under 1 million in population. So I think the focus on, small to mid-sized city with that kind of specificity is really distinctive and important. So, as you perhaps go forward, maybe actually continuing that as your focus, I think it's a godsend that in fact that you did end up in Boise because of COVID, because in some ways, they are where most urbanites live, and they're underserved in terms of the sort of intellectual focus of urbanists like yourself and others. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say.
I want to return to the teaching question that David started with, because we always, and back to actually Claudia bringing up this idea of a learning objective. One thing, especially in teaching in a PhD program, it's that teaching is not always related to learning. That I think is I would say largely how we think of teaching as a kind of practice of transmission of knowledge. Teaching, learning. What I thought was really amazing, or could be really amazing when you refine this, and this is back to Marcelin's point about tools, is that teaching as service, right? How to think about teaching as a service. So say, instead of thinking about the student as somebody who is learning, but rather as a student, as somebody, say, in the mayor's office would join your workshop, in the mayor's office at Boise, that some developer, a real estate person would join the workshop. And what is the incentive for them to join your workshop group, right? It's that your teaching is a service instead of, it's not a transmission of knowledge that you've gained. It's a set of operations and techniques that you are refining to include them in a conversation so that you can move their project forward, right? So what I think is important is to thematize a workshop. So mid-sized cities, it'd be interesting. You'd get one from, a state capital, say like Boise or Austin or something like this, but you might very well get some that's from, a neighborhood like, I don't know, Boyle Heights. It would be interesting then to see the different values that those people try to extract. If all you're saying is I'm servicing a population of, say, somewhere around 200,000, like there's I think the creative part of your project for me, from my point of view, is what is the role of teaching vis-a-vis its transmission? What does it transmit? And if it's not knowledge and it's a service, then you have to really think about your role as a teacher differently, I think.
I'm glad the conversation went here, because this was a kind of left turn, because he had to like pick up and move to Boise, which was an interesting decision, I thought. And then as we were talking at the beginning of summer about his experiences there, you know, a lot of what you've been working on is a pretty interesting case study in Boise. And I never would have guessed that it would have that kind of relevance. So I'm so glad you pointed that out, John, because then when we started combing through the data of the mid-sized cities in the United States, it's, wow, there's some interesting opportunity here for you.
Did you study Charlotte?
Well, I didn't study. I studied some of at the beginning of the project, I studied some kind of different cities similar to Boise, but with the more growing rates and less growing rate. And I'm trying to understand why that kind of city play different roles. And it's tied related with the things that I mentioned in the presentation. The city that has some kind of cluster of innovation or hubs in high tech are the ones that are booming in terms of migration. People from New York are going to Colorado, people from California are going to Boise, and now it's another city, Bozeman in Montana. This kind of migration are related with this kind of companies that are settled down there.
Because if you look along the East Coast as a, you know, in parallel to what you're doing for mid-sized cities, there are a whole bunch of there are a string of cities along the mountain range on one side, not the other side, the one nearest to the ocean, that extends from Virginia all the way down through Georgia as a regional development of interconnected mid-sized cities that have spent the last 40 years in pretty substantial kind of development. I mean, and I think maybe to critique it from your standpoint in terms of what you're thinking would be an interesting thing. But Charlotte is a very well documented case of a very small city where they've taken the last 40 years of their existence in terms of developing it along a certain premise. So I think there's a body of case study knowledge in the United States that would allow you then to see how the architect as agent participates in that. Just so happens that I helped to grow one of the largest architectural firms on the East Coast in the Carolinas in terms of development of that network of interconnected cities. And from a practice standpoint, our strategic plan was to look at the development of that network of mid-sized cities as a way of servicing the growth of those cities. So it's LS3P is the case study, which is the firm.
Interesting.
Yeah, I would join everyone in the wish to see more clear objectives and research questions. And maybe if you want students to be the workforce with which you develop the project further and you do research, then it's up to you to establish the methodology, at least, because they would and create that framework in which they can explore certain avenues. But I have another wish or suggestion is maybe a bit more critical about the notions that you put forward so freely, like private and public, because they're very fluent, and especially right now, if you think about our homes became very digitally public, right? And at the same time, how do you make public space of the street vibrant and inviting without cafes and without people consuming and going from shop to shop, which is a premise of Jan Gehl in many cases, right? Like his urban vision relies heavily on pretty wealthy society with specific work schedules and specific culture. So in general, I think it would be good for you and for the students to question every term you use and not to use it blindly. And that's my suggestion.
Yeah. I have a comment too, if I may. I think I joined all the comments, and it was very interesting to identify such a subject and a city amid a network of highways, and in a certain way, the product of the car culture. And you try to show a possible future after the car, no? A completely different sort of public space. But my suggestion or comment would be how to create a quality public space that is not a nostalgic recreation of the traditional public space of the European city or the comments of Jan Gehl, but something like aimed at the future, and which is actually the outcome of a new way of moving, and in terms of that, to think about the transition. No, you show like the end point, but in the middle there will be some sort of coexisting with cars and other forms of mobility, and I think it's interesting to explore that transition too.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that is something that is also in the middle of the stage. I wanted to provoke that conversation in terms of what happened after you accept the fact that we are going to deal with autonomous system and the cars are going to shift to another form, another type in every city. Maybe in the central areas of that kind of city. That I think is very important to mention, because I also think that this kind of experiment about the public space can be handled in the central core of the city and in a very compact way, not in the suburbia. That's another conversation, another discussion. The sprawl first, then the pollution, and then the global warming. That is another, like a set of things that taking place in another discussion. But I think in the central area we have an opportunity to develop some kind of a discourse or an argument to first be part of the transition and then hold the new forms.
Well, time flies when you're having fun. I'm afraid we're done, Emiliano. Our guests for this first session, Amanda, Masha, Paul, John, Andres, you're certainly welcome to hang out. They say in Monty Python, now for something completely different. Soledad Mora is going to go next. But if you're jumping off, we're really grateful for your time today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, David. And congratulations, Emiliano.
Great to see you.
Yes, congratulations, Emiliano. It's really, really interesting. Well done.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
So we have a new group of guests here. So we have Isla Berman, who is the Dean of the School of Architecture at the University of Virginia. Hey, Isla, good to see you. Pedro Ferrazzini. Pedro is a graduate of postgrad from last year, and he's now teaching in Rosario, where Soledad used to be. So we're inviting members of the family here too. And so is Ana Valderrama. Last time I saw you, Ana, you were planning to go to Princeton. Are you in Princeton now?
No, I'm not. I didn't go to the US because of COVID, but I didn't apply
Many
to
plans have
Princeton.
been disrupted. Yeah. Okay.
It didn't fit with my ideas about the thesis. So I decided
Well, Ana
to
is the
change
director
the
of the lab where Pedro works in Rosario. And so welcome, Pedro and Ana. Then Damian Jovanovic, who teaches here at SCI-Arc, he has joined us. Ferda Colaton, who's a professor of practice at the University of Pennsylvania, longtime co-conspirator of mine. Welcome, Ferda. John May is going to be a little bit late. He heads the MDes program at GSD. And Theodore Spiropoulos, also a longtime co-conspirator. Great to see you again, Theo. He is the director of the DRL at the AA. And we have the rest of us, the faculty of the Design Theory and Pedagogy program. So we have an hour to discuss Soledad's project. So the floor is yours. The grid is yours.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation, David. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. I will start sharing my screen. Are you seeing properly?
Yes.
Okay. So I will present all my work in a kind of online exhibition. And for me, this presentation is the way to look back to what I've done during the program retrospectively from some imaginary point in the future. So this presentation is set up as in a parafictional way, forcing me to look at the evidence of what I've done with some critical distance. This parafictional narrative was a way to format all the production then into a reverse perspective. It was for me a way to reflect on the pedagogical issues we are facing right now, and also the way to present this speculative pedagogical model that I will present from a reverse temporality. So looking the current situation as some time in the past, looking at it into an imaginary future. So this is called the Cybernetic Curriculum, and it's set from the eyes from the curatorial team, which was in charge of the exhibition, and that's when I will use the plural first person we. I'm referring to the curatorial team, and then when I'm referring to them, it's more about the Cybernetic Curriculum members. So I will play like different voices, but you will always be hearing my voice. So the term cybernetics derives from the Greek word kybernetic, which means to steer or to navigate. And it was initially used in conversation theory, which the objective was the construction of new knowledge. So for us, the curatorial team, was important to make the point on how this collective group of people understood the term cybernetics, which is the name that they gave to the curriculum. So what I will start to show you is the found documents of this curricular model. And for example, here we can see the founding statement, which proposed 4 major shifts in contrast to what was understood at the moment as the traditional curriculum. So the first shift is a new governance model from hierarchical tree-like leadership to horizontal navigation channels in a horizontal net. Instead of one captain, we will have like a crew of multiple sailors. The second shift is an unconventional approach to knowledge from static watertight compartments to interconnected flows. The third shift would be about novel pedagogical temporalities from a linear chronological way to understand it to an intensive and interconnected time flows. And the fourth shift is the integration of technical literacies, which will move them from the periphery to the core and integrated it from the very start of the program. So these are some of the pictures of the inaugural year before and after pandemics, how we can engage with it. And now we will move to this section, which is the first year curriculum, which plays a critical role in the cybernetic curriculum, as it really puts into practice the fourth shift, which is the integration of technical literacies, which was stated in the founding document. So in the first year, the curriculum immersed the student into the field of coding as a new form of literacy right from the start of the program. Actually, the instructors compared its importance with the skill of reading or writing, making the point that it's not possible to expect people to study literature without having the basic skills of reading and writing. And in that sense, it won't be possible to make people to engage with problems of technology without knowing, for example, how to code. That's why the first year curriculum stated that technical literacies, such as coding, should be taught from the very beginning. We will see some of the outcomes of the implementation later on in the select work section. But let me first show you the outline of the first year curriculum. That what was interesting was like the whole of organization of the first year was set as a non-linear interconnected workflows, and it were more like a circuit systems that represents in this diagram. So according to the specific objectives of each track of the workshop, each of them will provide the conceptual framework, methodological devices and tools for the student to acquire and strengthen the abilities and skills for formulating their ideas, communication, speculations, research models, and experimental production for their project. But it was somehow difficult to read it, so the curatorial team prepared a kind of video to deploy these ideas. So first, each line, each horizontal line would be one like split area of knowledge in the traditional curriculum. And then what the cybernetic curriculum do is this shift, they disperse all these different kind of knowledge. And now each track is a different workshop, which contains inside and within conceptual framework, research, critical thinking, critical writing, design process, testing models, and so on. And this kind of wiring is how these workshops were meant to be like deployed during time. And in the right part of the screen, we can see like small samples of what were they reading and what were they designing. Meanwhile, these sequences were conducted. So for example, each of these workshops are somehow deployed simultaneously, and different group of students can jump in and out each line of track according to its specific objectives and according to the specific main project they are running in one specific time. So each flow had each of these lines, and each flow is embedded with 3 different levels of information. So these wires refers to the content, that is to say the attitude of dissolving the disciplines of knowledge and mix them and rewire them, as I explained. The second is the temporality. I mean, each line means different track of temporality, proposing an open relationship to the way students spend their times during their education. I'll be finished with this. And then how the community is organized. So there are different flows of instructor, advisors, students, and groups embedded in each of these lines. So now I will walk you through the selected works. These are intended just to make some samples of how this pedagogical model can work. and to have a glimpse on the studies and works that was produced especially by students, which are anonymous because like the point is to show the big array of production instead of some specific novel student or instructor. So we will begin with the procedural workshop, which was foundational for this curriculum. And these are the kind of documents we found when the instructors were preparing the material and how they design and understand the classes, and how this all mixed up was also reflected on how they thought about how to deploy these workshops. And these are the kind of syllabi that were produced just to run them. And the procedural workshop was somehow key for the cybernetic curriculum because this is where the students were just pushed into technological literacies right from the beginning, and understanding how algorithmically thinking and procedural thinking, for example, of techniques of weaving and studying Annie Albers and the procedural artists like Barry Leva, Sol Lewitt, or Francois Morellet, make some influences on the work. And these are the kind of templates production of the student. So in coding, they start learning how to read coding. So they were given the instruction from Lewitt, and they need to translate it visually. The second sequence was about writing. So they were given the visual material, and they need to write the instruction in order to get that result. And then in the sequence 3, they are more like confident on how to write and read, and they start to make the first somehow primitive designs, combining them with the notation system of weaving, for example. So the procedural workshop was more analog oriented, and then they start to build up on this learning experience and go through digital coding, for example, in Python for Rhino, how these recipes can be write in a very precise way, and how this set of instructions, when are run by a computer, give this kind of outcomes. But they are always using like the precedent, not in the traditional way, but how, like trying to reverse engineering how they were designing. As these two workshops are super like hands-on, simultaneously they were going through critical writing workshop, where they approach to the resources from a critical and more conceptual way, and they start designing short exercises about how to write these ideas and how to develop them in a very straightforward way. And then, for example, there was this notion how this procedural thinking can be immersed in the physical way, in the physical world, in the material world. So they start to translate that kind of notation, design with them, and move them to the material world through fabric formworks. So they start notating it and designing it in a binary way at the beginning, and then the unexpected emerge in the physical world, where they cannot control actually the behavior of the plastic material, the fluid material. And for doing that, they also go through craft, traditional craft like sewing, like weaving, through the book of Colette Wolfe. So they always approach to traditional craft, but from a very contemporary way. And then they keep working on different kind of exercises, which were running also parallel to them, this kind of geometrical taxonomies in 2D and 3D. And then how these logics can also be tested in a 2D and a 3D digital environment. And how these unstructured grids, as Delanoy and Voronoj's overlappings, can bring a new system into the design process. So I can share them the link so you can go through the presentation and the works. But just as a closing, I would like to go through the founding statement again, just to take an in-depth look at it, which was written collectively by the anonymous group of the Cybernetic Curriculum. We have recovered the recording of the speech, so I will go through it, maybe only the beginning, just to have an idea of it.
After long and heated discussions, we have collectively...
Are you hearing?
Yes.
Okay.
After long and heated discussions, we have collectively agreed on what we believe should be, from now on, the emerging and progressive learning system for architecture. We will leave behind once and for all the traditional curriculum, which was installed as a fixed cohesive unit, as a rigid organization divided into disconnected areas of knowledge, which so far were functioning detached from the others, and based on a predetermined distribution of time. The homogenization of content according to the traditional patterns of academic programs for architecture is over, as is the standardization of knowledge and its access models. In opposition to this outdated model, we embrace the cybernetic approach that establishes these four major shifts.
So the shifts are, as I say, like the new governance model, the unconventional approaches to knowledge, the novel pedagogical temporalities, the integration of technical literacies. So this statement ends with this encouraging statement that says, the cybernetic curriculum is the opportunity to overcome the inertia with which architecture has been taught up to now, and to rethink and redesign the pedagogical models of our times. The curriculum of this century is emerging, the cybernetic curriculum. So in a kind of looping back, because this curriculum is all about looping, looping to the beginning of the presentation, in words of Carrie Lambert-Beatty, who writes about parafictional narratives, she says, like, this project does not give us the idea that this is actually a fact, but allow us to rethink them as a matter of investment, debate, and desire. This is precisely the territory of parafiction, which at once reveals the way things are and how we want them to be. Thank you.
Soledad, before you sign off, maybe you could focus some attention on the so-called curator statement just below what you have here. I pasted her website link into the chat window. If any of you would like to go back and forth to it. I guess what I found interesting about this parafictional take on presenting her curricular research is it gave her an opportunity to have some sense of irony too. So like looked at from the future, can also acknowledge what didn't change and what failed and what remains obscure. So with that, we can open it up to discussion. We have some strong pedagogues here in the grid, so I would imagine the debate might get heated, I hope.
I'm afraid I have to start because I also have another meeting to go to, Soledad. So I want to first of all mark my great appreciation for the effort that you've made to take yourself out of the center of this, because there couldn't be a more cybernetic way of approaching things as understanding them as a network. That said, the artifice is clear, and there's like it's difficult for the fictional quality of it is so clear that it's layering into reality is something that I suppose I only experienced in one instance, and that was in the photograph of the gallery of the inaugural exhibition. And that is really jarring, and it's quite productive as a way of imagining a reality that might exist but doesn't. And I would imagine, from my point of view anyway, that adding more sort of potentially disruptive and kind of experiences like that, where all of a sudden our reality mixes with that reality of this fictional thing, it's difficult, but it might not only need to happen in an image, it might have happened in, so the curatorial statement almost gets us there, but it's not quite, right? Like if it had actually appeared in the New York Times, or it had appeared, you know, all of a sudden next to, like the school had to be shut down because of COVID, but it's the only school in some respects that's perfect for the pandemic. We might have been able to begin to talk about its relationship to our reality. And I think right now it still looms as a kind of, what we're really reading is a kind of map of the neural network in your brain, rather than a potential way of opening that up into a kind of broader sort of input-output circuitry, where this thing really does belong to a context of other sort of synaptic relationships. So that would be my preliminary comment. Otherwise, I just really do need to, again, loop back, as it were, to the appreciation of the artifice. And I really think that there's a lot of maturity in that. And because of its maturity, we can see the potential flaws and the ways in which we might want to fix them.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's so, like, with so much attention, you've tailored your whole syllabus. I think it's a curriculum. I think it's super interesting. And I don't know why I would be the last to say that, but I think that if you look at accreditation and you try to get even more specific and try to find like what kind of, because you separate in like 5 types of knowledge. And I'm wondering, would this somehow match to accreditation values that you need to have a license to educate? And I'm wondering if that would be the link that Michael is mentioning, to link back to reality, maybe through policies and accreditation. But other than this, I think it's, yeah, beautifully done, and you definitely took a lot of care.
I would like to say something. May I?
Sure.
Well, congratulations, Soledad. I'm happy you are receiving your master's degree. And I have some questions. I think it's very interesting, the approach of a curriculum you are presenting. I think it's for the first years in architecture. But I think some questions for you. When I see the network you made, distributing the different steps in the education process, I would like to know what is in the middle from one step to the other. Because I can see some idea of chain process, that from one process to the other process, you have something to transform or inform from one to the other. And I think it's very important when you design this kind of continuing transformative process to think about the gap between two of them. Because this is the space in time where students make their own. You have there the creativity of students apart from the protocols. And I think it's very important to think about what happens in the middle between these two steps. And Another question is about the products. I think you have instructions, then you have art design in the middle, precedents, fabric craftings, and geometrical taxonomies. But maybe you can leave some space for other kind of products that students can propose. This is something that we always think about. I have a studio, 3-year studio in the first 3 years in the architecture program. And we always think about the parameters and the way we can leave the imagination in some specific points so that students can propose their own creativity. So we are all the time moving between these restrictions and freedom. But the freedom has to be very planned so that you know in what is the space where students can create and what is the space where students only obey the instructions. Or this is, then I can make another questions. So the problem of the space between 2 steps.
Yeah, so for me, like the lines can work like sequenced, but for example, one specific student or group of students can jump in and out in any part of that network according to the needs they have. And for me, the space in between is precisely the space for the feedback loops, where like the feedback loops work as the gaps fillers, where the interrelationship between different kind of experience emerge and get translated in the next kind of workshop. Because like each line can be deployed in sequence, but only you can make different jumps into that network. On the second question, I totally agree with it. We discussed with David how this kind of collection of outcomes may look like, but as it was parafictional, it was all through my own subjectivity because I produced them. So that's why it looks Unitarian. But if we can test it with 5 or 6 or 10 or 100 in the public university we are used to work, we may have for sure a different kind of collection and a different kind of conversation and discussion may arise from that different subjectivities. In the previous semester with Marceline, we have a brief moment where each of the DTP students test the other's proposals. And this, in that moment, we had a kind of discussion. Unfortunately, given the times we had, we didn't do it in this semester. So it was more like unilateral approach. But for sure, your comments are super like precise for this topic.
You know, maybe if I may jump in, I think it's an interesting answer you gave, given that your project is a parafictional project, for you then to say, well, it looks kind of homogeneous because I was the only one who was producing the results of a multiplied type of system. You could have, of course, very easily slipped into different roles and do very, very different projects as a result. It seems to me, maybe even without you yourself admitting it, there was a desire to have it look uniform in some way. That's what I got. I mean, there was a certain desire in the aesthetic to speak to standardization, which you're actually critiquing, right? You're against the standardization of knowledge, as you call it, yet what you produce is very, very protocol driven and standardized in the outcome. So I wasn't quite sure if that's a built-in deliberate irony in the project or not. If it was, it's really, really well done, because I'm not sure if it is or not. If it is not, then it's certainly something to think about. I have another observation. I'm super interested in the question of knowledge, again, I guess, in terms of how we define it. And I think, I mean, if any question is pressing these days, from the political spectrum all the way to the environmental spectrum, it may be the question of knowledge. And it appears we are yet at another moment of a paradigmatic shift where we may have to completely redraw our understanding of what knowledge even means, which of course happens every so often. You know, in the Middle Ages, knowledge had something to do with revelation, scripture, and modernity. Through Descartes, it became something that we would actually figure out by just thinking hard enough. The scientific model based on reason, on and on, right? So there are all these different types of knowledge. Each comes along with some either technological innovation or crises. I don't know, the Black Plague is just as important to have triggered the Renaissance as, let's say, the emerging financial systems in Northern Italy. So there are all kinds of interesting moments where a shift happens that changes the way how we think about knowledge. And to assume that we may be exactly at that point again, not only because of, let's say, COVID, but also because of the way how technologically we're connected. You know, you're talking about networks a lot, and it's not about just networking between us, it's also about networking with machines, and sort of, you know, blurring the boundary between human agency and machine agency and so forth, that whole thematic. That seems to be a new kind of knowledge. I mean, if that isn't a new kind of knowledge, then I don't know what is. And I'm very interested in what that could mean for teaching, for curriculum, architecture, and so forth. But in your proposal, it appears implied, and yet you fall a little short and sort of reaching with your hand into that sticky jar, right? And I would suggest you push even more, you know, harder into these kinds of questions. It's somehow the project as a curriculum maintains a bit hermetically sealed to me, right? And it just, what it produces is a bit too known. And I would sort of put it more within the regime of a 1990s technological approach to knowledge, rather than one that may push into a very different parafictional reality.
Thanks, Soledad. I wanted to say maybe just a couple things. I very much appreciated your framing of the project and what you've done. I think it's both incredibly interesting and critically important, especially at this moment in time. You know, because it points to the difference between, let's say, using a technological model or using technologies to support pedagogy and a curriculum, which is what we are all doing now in the face of COVID, to using the model of cybernetics to rethink the structure of the curriculum and potentially the structures of knowledge and what we value within that and the larger educational model. So I was also asking myself the question around the kinds of contents that you take on. Like, what would be fascinating to me in some ways is how the model would transform an existing curriculum. And I say that because it's about, you know, engaging a certain idea of the real, even within the fiction. And by real, I mean, you know, it's the dominant set of cultural myths of our time, whatever those might be. And maybe it goes to what Yara was saying initially in terms of, if you think about what, you know, NAB might set as a kind of curriculum, or what various schools would set, how that would be transformed by the new governance model, the unconventional approaches to knowledge, the novel pedagogical temporalities, those things that become the new structures, you know, and how they would transform those territories. Because I think if there's any homogeneity, it's because it's something that you're constructing, and by the nature of that artifice, we don't, let's say, feel the tension as much as we might between an existing phenomenon and this the new cybernetic curriculum. One of the things that was, in a way, most shocking to me and yet not, right, is the idea that programming and coding we might think of as something, well, it happens now, but if we actually equate it to language, and I mean really equate it to language, right? Like, we learn language, you know, not when we start in first year in a school in architecture, but, you know, but after we're born. And to actually imagine that certain kinds of languages would start to be equated with the way in which we use language is absolutely radical, right? That restructures our world. And for me, that was a thread, because I kept thinking, you know, if we imagine, because that's about value, but it's also about the structures of the ways in which we think and operate, and how much that would actually change what we do. I've always, you know, made the argument in some ways that how we work within an architectural context is so defined by language being so dominant, you know, within our culture, such that visual language becomes secondary to that. And if you think of coding operating within that system, how would that absolutely transform our structures, our ways of operating, et cetera? So, you know, I would congratulate you, and I would just encourage you to push it even further to becoming more radical, and at the same time, kind of tie it back to the real in such a way that you can see the effects that would be produced by this new frame.
Yeah, maybe just to engage in a slightly different conversation. It seems to me like you stumbled onto a way of thinking about the curriculum in the way that you're structuring it, through novelty, through constructing frameworks, through an idea of governance, which has a kind of long-standing history in cybernetics. There was a man named Gordon Pask who wrote a very famous article about the architectural relevance of cybernetics. And the basic premises with pedagogy in mind was that architects really don't have any way of coping with complexity. So they would have to take a systemic approach to that. But systemic with that was much more about giving agency to things, and in some sense, not necessarily having this kind of binary relationship between us and things. We were kind of observers of and in the situation of observing. And I think that kind of set up, I think, really interesting experiments, which also challenge the kind of orthodoxies of discipline. You don't speak really to the audience of who a student is, but Macy's conferences and all of those things were sociologists, biologists, philosophers. They were coming from everywhere with the idea of actually really having an open framework. And I think in terms of education, and for sure, for architecture to have some kind of relevance, it has to somehow construct a framework which I think challenges its own orthodoxies. Because I think some of the language that you use, I can support quite strongly. But there are also some things that actually fall into, I think, discourses of the 90s, like networks and network theory, this kind of conversation, or the digital in some sense. And I think that there are probably some deeper kind of ways of thinking about intelligence, and further mentioned knowledge. And I think one of the things that cybernetics was very much looking into is models that learned. So I think that learning aspect is something that is very worthwhile to re-examine, and also to understand where intelligence lies, or how we understand understanding. So there are people like Hans von Forester, who was running the biological computation lab, which his experiments, I think, were very interesting, and you could have a look at some of that stuff. I think that there are a lot of architectural projects that were also governed by that. My own PhD supervisor was a student of Pask and von Forster. And he made the argument that design was actually the most cybernetic of processes, because in some sense, you could have a conversation with yourself. He was looking at conversation theory as a way to really have agency, to work in a place which I think would challenge maybe this divide between the so-called parafictional and real. I mean, I'm not sure that's very helpful to you, but I think if you thought about it slightly differently, and you thought of it in a cybernetic way, you would call it a thought experiment. So you put it in a black box, you test your assumptions, and you're given a result. And I think if you think a little bit more intimately about what that would mean in terms of teaching and learning, and what that causality would be for students, my PhD supervisor used to talk about something called teach back, which means you may be thinking that you're teaching something, but you have no accessibility to how a student is actually understanding what you're saying. So the only real way that we have is, I think, to build on what Ayla was talking about, is you could speak of it as language, but I would call it communication in whatever form that would be. And in some sense, that abstraction allows you to think that design could also be a way that we speak through drawings, or we speak through interaction, or we speak through installation. And I think if you open up the comments of format and some of these other things, you may actually find yourself in a place where novelty is one of those things that you actually are encouraging by not actually being very prescriptive of what a workshop's aim actually is. I would challenge all the orthodoxies of how an architecture school evaluates education. I think that's what's in quite a beautiful provocation in your title, but I think you should look a little bit more deeply into some of the experiments, because I mean the economy of Chile was supposed to be run on a cybernetic system. So this idea of governance took on a very, very active model that I think those projects revisited from today's perspective would be very interesting. So I think it's a really interesting provocation, and I think it opens up a lot of things, but I would really try to challenge the framework of your workshop. And I mean, I like fabric formwork, I like all of this other stuff, but I think you can actually try to have something that's not tied to a way of working, and just allow the students' interactions to somehow construct frameworks for themselves to actually work in a more cybernetic way.
Soledad, I really appreciate this kind of curricular archaeology that you presented to us, but there is an archaeological quality, also exactly that, what Theo was just mentioning, that the fabric formworks, the Voronoi, I mean, the discussion, I kind of wish that, and I know why you did that, because it's something that you had access to at that moment that you could work on. But I think returning to what Michael brought up about you removing yourself from the equation, I almost think I would love to see a subsequent version. There's some kind of echo. A subsequent version of this where you select some work that's ongoing, you know, maybe at SCI-Arc right now in one of the vertical studios, or one of the core, somebody who, you know, I'm looking at Damien right now, working with game engines, or something that's really, really of the moment. So you could push, because when I look at the statement, the words are telling me, you know, this sort of radical technical literacies, and I'm thinking, okay, what is technical literacy right now at this very moment? So I would almost plug in, even if you have not yet worked with those tools, but speculate and say, what if students came to a school and immediately had to interact, they had to construct an environment in a game engine, and that's how they would interact with each other in a classroom, like instead of Zoom. I don't know, it could be something like that. I think that would be great, and that would be a very, I think, an update that you could do. I would actually really encourage you to do that for your sort of portfolio of this, because I think that the discussion with the Voronoi and the fabric formworks and some of those things, we've seen installations like that, it sort of looks back to the history a little bit. And I want you to look forward. but I love the setup. I think it's fantastic. I love the recording of the discussion where you said, you know, we found this recording and we're talking about the curriculum. And there's some very radical ideas about the governance. I mean, I'm curious what someone like Isla thinks about, you know, the proposition that you no longer need a dean or chairs to structure this curriculum, but that there are modules and students will navigate their way through and they can pick and choose, which could be a really contemporary solution to some of the dilemmas about the cost of higher education and who has access and who does not have access. So I think there's a lot in there to go with. But I would love to know a little bit more about how you're thinking about that, because who guarantees the expertise? Like all of these modules, how do you know that you get some core competency after you sequence through? I mean, once when I was teaching in Stockholm, we had this discussion because students in the core, the courses were also electives. So potentially somebody could always take classes where they avoided having to ever design a building, for instance, or somebody could take classes where they only worked on the problem of housing. And, you know, we actually had a debate in the faculty. I was like, is this really, you know, is this really what you want? I don't know. Anyway, I think there's so much here. I really want to commend you. It's raises a lot of really important questions and potential sort of ways forward for us.
Yeah, Soledad, I think this is a great project in many ways. It's really well structured. But I would agree with Marcelin that there is a bit of a kind of a tension to maybe more rational forms of kind of technical knowledge that maybe don't take into account some of the contemporary issues related to, like, you know, introduction of like desire or introduction of aesthetics into the kind of the technical discourse, you know. And maybe that's the question of style. Maybe that's how you actually want to have it, or maybe you think this is how it's easier to teach in some ways because it's verifiable. You know, you can actually verify the results based on that kind of easy mapping between techniques of weaving and some kind of, you know, translation into code and then translation into language. But I would question that mapping actually. I think, and especially this idea that code is close to language. I think there are, I don't know if there is any proof for that. And I think we're talking about two completely different axiomatic systems of kind of operation. And that easy analogy between them, I think is kind of problematic to me to some extent, you know. But another point that I wanted to bring was that I think irony and maybe parafiction is increasingly becoming kind of a coping mechanism within the projects. You know, whenever I kind of see this approach right in the project right now, it seems like that they're there to really deflect any possible questions about the actual apparatus that you're kind of trying to deal with. You know, and they do bring this other level of like meta, right? The meta inquiry that you can actually have. But eventually, I think they're kind of ineffective to really kind of frame the technical problem of which every curriculum, as you said, it would have a technical problem. It would have something where it's based on this idea of how technique or how technology produces the effects and how we can actually verify that and map that, you know. But if you look at the history of cybernetics, actually there is and I think Theo mentioned that, there is something called the second order cybernetics, right? Which is kind of the meta level of cybernetics, whereby cybernetics itself became the part of the cybernetic cycle, right? And that's actually more meta than the parafiction. If you really look into that history, it's so interesting because they were thinking that you cannot possibly kind of understand the world without introducing the brain itself, the apparatus of understanding itself, as part of the system. You know, and I think if you wanted to have that kind of complexity in the project, I think it might have been more interesting to look at that model of adding layers than actually looking into the parafictional, which it's in some level becomes a performative kind of layer, and maybe it doesn't really give you any answers that you might want to have. But really, I mean, this might be just something that I would do. Look into the conditions of the syllabus itself and how that is part of the whole cybernetic system that you're setting, and so it's not outside of it, which I think is the crucial problem that I would see with your project, is that it kind of reinforces that idea that we can somehow look from the outside onto the framing of the problem without understanding that we are actually part of that framing.
Well, I mean, maybe one way to make that really direct is just to also challenge what a student is. I mean, the assumption as a student is a human, but if I play a cybernetic game at the moment, I would say, well, why couldn't it be an AI? Why aren't we educating AIs to not have habitual reinforcement learning, but we're part of larger kind of intelligent agency that's not making that human, non-human divide? I mean, like, if we're really talking about the future of education, I think in some way we have to use these opportunities to actually challenge everything. And I think your title is a provocation, but I think the history sets up a certain argument. So I agree with Damian that there are things there that I think you can really challenge your own way of structuring what you think an architect is. At the end of the day, most of those guys who were in architecture wanted to make the architect obsolete. Negroponte with the architecture machine group didn't really care about the architect like we talk about now as a figure. It was about a system, and there was system aesthetics and all kinds of other more participatory ways of thinking about it. So I just put that as a provocation, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about.
Just to quickly pick up, Theo, on what you said in one way, I agree with that. I agree particularly in regard to sort of different types of agency that no longer follow, sort of the classical human nature divide or culture, nature, technology, and so forth. It's striking to me that we talked about language, code, and communication. And sort of some feel they're very different in the context of your project. And others may feel that maybe they're sort of like, forking into each other or converging in interesting ways. One thing that I would like to add to the conversation is I think there's a simultaneity. I mean, it's very rarely the fact that any one of these types of concepts sees and then the other one takes over. And it appears that communication in particular is very different anyway than, let's say, language and code, right? Language in its 20th century history of its structure and so forth comes with a whole other set of like thought models. To understand when we break away from a human-centric, anthropocentric notion of agency, what that means for concepts of language, code, and communication, I think is super interesting. And to me, it goes back to the whole idea of knowledge, or how do we even define knowledge in this day and age, and knowledge for who, by who, to what purpose? Or is there at all like no teleology at all, no purpose, just protocol? Is that what we're doing? Is that where it's going? Which may very well be the case, by the way, as far as I can tell. But I think, so these to me are super interesting and provocative notions you're dealing with. And I don't know, I mean, I would want you to also really think about, 3 different jurors mentioned seemingly related concepts of language through code and then communication, and what that would mean for this curriculum in regard to the notion of non-human agency, as Theo is pointing out. I think is a whole other part of the equation here in your project.
I would like to...
Go ahead, Pedro.
Oh yeah, sorry. First of all, thanks for the invitation. It's very nice to be at home, virtually at least.
Welcome back.
Thank you. I have to say that I find this project like very honest, and that is a good thing to say these days. I I remember Soledad saying me that she was worried about these things, and finally at the end of this entire year, she brought out these projects, which is very nice. I really like the part that you almost treat us as a persons that, first of all, we have to learn how to read and write, which is hilarious, I believe. And once we are there, and then we find out how to read and write, then everything is transformed. And because I know your background, my question is, or at least I hope that you have an answer for this. My question is, how do you think this could be applied in Rosario? You know, because I find it like very challenging to once I went back from LA, try to do this AI seminar here in Argentina, and now that I believe that this question that I'm doing is almost like inevitable for me. You know, like how do you imagine transforming the curriculum of here? You know, do you have an answer for that?
Ooh, that's a hard one.
Yeah, actually, like all our discussion with David was like how, like the way to maybe start implementing this, for me have like two different tracks. One is to start from ground zero, something like radical, experimental, and small. The other is like in traditional system as ours, the leak is in the electives, you know, like nobody will give you like the first year curricular design just to do something out of the box in a traditional institution or something like have a history. And then, okay, a way to test it is somehow the more experimental areas that our curriculums have, which are the electives or the short seminars somehow. I think it's somehow achievable. I mean, I started learning in my 30s, and actually the discussion with David was how I can start to imagine how to teach it if I'm starting to learn it somehow. Like I don't have like this kind of experience, but it's feasible somehow. I think it's feasible. It is already tested, so I think we have a kind of security ground, or like a system that is saying us it could be possible, feasible, and somehow successful.
You know, I was trying to provoke you because we find out that AI seminar like really shocked us with super good results. So I was trying to see if you thought that.
That's what I meant about testing successfully. Like we already talked about how the first year you implemented the AI seminar was like excessively more successful than everyone was expecting. So, and here I make the point, like I think further talk about that, like between the teacher and the learner, apparently there's transmission of content. I don't believe that. I believe like there's something in between. Like,
you know, I think this is a pretty interesting way to start wrapping up here, because part of the fun of this program is to then see like how you take what you've done this year and go to another place, you know. So Pedro is graduate of SCI-Arc, and not this particular program, but it in some ways it functioned the same way for Pedro. Yara is a graduate of this program, and she's teaching studio at UCLA now. And earlier, Claudia Weiner, she's now teaching core at Cal Poly Pomona. And I think it's related to what Damian was suggesting about the parafictional, and maybe the unstated real questions of such projects. One of the interesting conversations Soledad and I had was about Pale Fire by Nabokov. And that's a weird book, you know, because he writes this epic poem of 999 lines, and then there's a concordance of it afterwards by a crazy commentator who doesn't actually seem that interested in the poem, but he's commenting on it. And the whole thing is, and then he has a preface to it, and it annoys a lot of literary critics. Like, poets are very split on this question, is that a good poem or not? Some say actually that is one of the greatest poems of the 20th century. That is the parafictional poetry part. Others say it's absolute shit and he's hiding behind it and so on. But all in all, it is one of the great novels, I would say, of the 20th century. But interestingly, Nabokov never did that again. You know, like he never wrote another parafictional novel. You know, so whatever it was he was working out through the writing of that then impacted, you know, subsequent novels. You know, which I guess became a little more real, quote unquote, but you know, more in a standard format. So like the real question, I think, and I think Isla brought this up before about the question of pre-existing programs. I think that's ultimately the real problem. Like, how do you enter into the programs that we already have, into the curriculums we already have? And what is it about this parafictional idea which allows you to propose something without being 100% naively confident in possible success, but you could also talk about how it fails, you know? And what insight does that give us into how we might be able to rework the systems we already have, I think is the major big ticket question. So that might be the actual second order cybernetics here. You know, there is a bigger cybernetic question here that's not being talked about, I think.
I would like to put in the table the fact that for me it's very interesting to have this proposal for changing the curriculum we have in the school. In fact, I offer my studio with 150 students to make an experiment of this. I think something very potential of this idea is the collective knowledge, this idea of collective knowledge that for me should be more profound. Because we could think that some students are in critical thinking step, others in tech skill, digital tools, and others in conceptual framework. And then they can inform each other and work like in a network among them. Because I think this curriculum is still like individual works, and we can make it more collective, and you can mix or inform the work one student is doing in discursive skills with other student who is doing design process. In other words, we can make it more collective and think that this is the whole process of design. I mean, because I see this blue cycle that is design process, and I think that all this is design process. Everything is part of the design process, and we don't have to think that design process ends in a design, in a regular design. Maybe the design process could end in a writing thing or in something that we couldn't imagine. And but you can mix everything, thinking about a collective knowledge. And this is something that I think could be very interesting, including crossing students from different ages and different levels in the career. And you can make this experiment and see what happens.
You know, Anna, the thing that I find the most esoteric and the most intriguing, you know, that's gonna, I know is gonna linger with me a little bit about her manifesto is this point about, odd temporalities of the education. That's something I wanna think about more, like this idea of prerequisites or foundation to advanced and core versus vertical, you know. but that all of that can be there simultaneously every step of the way. Like there's a core and an advanced at every moment, and things can loop in unexpected ways. And I'm also thinking about this in postgrad in general, like how to loosen up or find ways to cheat the bureaucracy where possible, or to allow for some of these to happen. Because the bureaucracy is necessary to some degree. That's not going to go away anytime soon, but there may be ways to loosen it up to allow for some of these things. I know, Theo, you've done a lot of experimentation with it at the DRL too, just in timeline and structure. I always thought that was fascinating at the DRL.
Like I would just say, like, maybe one way to be practical is also to reject curriculum, at least in the way that it's being discussed. And in SCI-Arc and AA, for example, its early history was, in some sense, putting that into question, not to full out reject it without the idea of licensing and all of that, but just to question where education and knowledge resides. And maybe that's not with conventional ways of success, but I do think that they also play an important value to question those structures, because, for example, if I want to be super practical, many of the students that are coming, how many are going for licensing? When did accreditation actually define education, for example? Or even the idea of what a collaborative project is today could be somehow questioned within the orthodoxy of what we mean by practice as well. So I just mean, like, when we start to open up these questions, and I think that's what's the interesting part of having this kind of way of trying to construct pedagogy, is at the same time, if you're too practical, then you're trying to use it as a blueprint to map into an existing institution instead of questioning actually the institution's overhanded curriculum kind of dominance in terms of how you're trying to fit in the box. And I do think that you can experiment with things and still be able to communicate the learning outcomes, but you may have to do it in ways that are a little bit more subversive. And I think the cybernetic strategy potentially is a doorway through that. I don't know, at least in the UK, for example, right now, we don't have many people going for REBA accreditation. And of course, all the students want to have that opportunity, but very few are actually fulfilling the licensing examination. And that's actually putting a very different kind of spin on what architectural education's mandate actually is and what professional practice really is. And I do think that these are also very practical questions as well when we discuss these things. So.
Yeah, I was going to say, I totally agree. I mean, in some ways, I think the model itself is incredibly radical. And it's certainly radical if you use it to question everything that we might be doing, even within different models. I mean, just the idea of the first notion of shifting hierarchies or removing hierarchies, the whole idea of core and electives, disappears. The idea of a first-year curriculum, if you're questioning the linearity or chronology of knowledge and how that gets built, again, disappears. At some point, I had asked the question, what would it mean if we actually started thinking about, the kind of mass customized student as a notion of education, right? Where every single student has a totally different learning experience, which they do anyway, right, within the models that they're operating in. But I think that I think it's far more radical, even as a kind of archaeological cut of an idea of cybernetics than we imagine, and that we could do far more with it by pushing, using it as a tool to really push and think about what we're actually doing every day.
Hey, I think that was good. So, hey, we're gonna see the final student for today, Mohammed. It's yours.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. Let me share the screen. So please confirm that my voice in the slideshow is audible, okay?
We don't hear anything.
We don't hear.
You can hear? Okay.
Yep.
Welcome to my vertical studio named Rendered Visible. So let me first introduce the syllabus. This vertical studio operates as an effective pedagogical vehicle that would sharpen students' sensory engagement and design. The exclusiveness of the architecture of the naked eye has jeopardized our sensations. The vision is to push students to exploit artificial sensory channels in their design process to complement their spatial sensibilities. The first challenge encountered by us as architects is the persistent or obsolete modes of representations that disregards the new regime of datascapes. As a result, we need to venture out into this new order and acknowledge that the human is not the sole perceiver of the physical world. Secondly, the studio recognized the inherent fallibility of our unassisted senses in perceiving and creating architecture. This has restrained human power from pushing the envelope of the visible universe. Accordingly, this entails the outsourcing of machine perception and tapping into emerging technology borrowed from other disciplines. These man-made means of sensations should be brought into play to diagnose and address architecture differently. This will eventually construct a synthetic extension to our bodies. However, a harmony should first be established in the interface between the body and the machine to empower our sensations without any hindrances. The study goes through three main stages: signalization, translation, and synthesis. In signalization, the adopted agenda in hand exemplifies the migration to the utilization of imagery and data language. We appropriate signalized apparatuses that aid the process of encoding and retrieval of movement in architecture. In this phase, we will mobilize energy detectors that perceive and process real-time data to generate presentational models that could substitute static representations. Secondly, translation. In this phase, the registered data is transcribed into quantifiable variables that could be processed to formulate new modes of aesthetics. Our habitual perception of the world is destabilized by granting access to a new type of consciousness that translates invisible external stimuli into conceivable objects. Lastly, synthesis. In this stage, the spatial qualities processed by the artificial perceptual tools are now materialized. The study constitutes of 4 correlative parts. First, a preparatory phase where all of the exploration happens. Students employ their provided palliative tools to capture the ephemeral qualities of their environment. It constitutes of series of workshops where the techniques are introduced and experimented with. This stage is also named signalization, where we appropriate unexplored apparatuses for use in architecture. The second phase introduces unprecedented modes of creativity, where students contemplate the unfamiliar tools and media. A state of defamiliarization is induced here by expanding their horizons and opening new channels of design they are not yet accustomed to. The third stage merely focuses on the translation of the registered images into a statistical and computational data that could derive unexpected outcomes. The final stage is named synthesis, which spans over a great portion of the studio timeline. Because in this stage, students are asked to apply their acquired skill set by synthesizing the scanned imagery and translating it into a cohesive architecture. First, signalization. In this first stage, the sensory kit is introduced. Here I intended to capitalize on a gear that could potentially mediate new impressions of architectural objects. The cross-pollination of technical knowledge and tools will ultimately constitute an autonomous consciousness that is neither exclusive to the mechanic nor the organic, but rather coincide within both domains. The deployment of these sensory instruments in architecture could cultivate unprecedented forms and can remove the perceived objects from the automatism of perception and draw our attention to its odd qualities. The purpose behind this assemblage of tools is to disclose and awaken the imperceptible qualities of what I call the dormant stimuli that cannot be perceived without calling in similar exotic technologies. Every group of 3 students is handed a sensory kit that costs around $1,500. Students are now granted access to an infinite type of statistical consciousness, whose efficiency in data encoding and retrieval supersedes that of humans. For this, students are asked to employ the assigned 3 techniques, namely photogrammetry, laser scanning, and thermography, to break out of their comfort zone, their design comfort zone. This preliminary stage offers students the essential training and hands-on experience and practice with those apparatuses to confront the limitations of human perception. Through each of those 3 procedures, we're aiming to resist architecture as a stagnant visual phenomenon and engage some suprahuman receptors that can detect motion. This phase is a melting pot of scanning techniques that paves the way for supplementary tools that are still not fully embraced. The sensory kit unveils 3 main apparatuses: a DSLR camera, a LiDAR sensor, and a thermal imager. The second phase, abstraction. In this phase, defamiliarization intensifies because of the change in the representational form of the thermal imagery, but without any change in its nature. In this stage, I used aluminum metal sheet as a blank canvas for my thermal paintings, but any other highly conductive material is recommended too, like copper or silver. In this case, heat energy is the brush strokes that can be processed and displayed in 9 standardized formats, like the grayscale, iron, and rainbow thermal palettes. The quality of the painting can vary depending on the ambient temperature and the emissivity of the scanned material. These abstract paintings are mainly developed by the means of heat conduction and sunlight exposure. Here I also played around with liquids and other substances on the sheet to get the desired outcome. There are literally endless possibilities of transforming the blank metal sheet into an invisible work of art that can only be appreciated through the lens of the machine. These ephemeral artifacts are always in constant flux, so it's not just about the composition, but also about the right timing of capturing it. Moving on to the third stage, translation. This phase takes the formal production to the next level by processing and translating the capture imagery into a script that could generate architecture. I will definitely be conducting a number of tutorials in this particular phase for students to learn how to construct grasshopper definitions to serve them in image processing. Without going into much technical details, in simple terms, the values are extracted from the thermal image by detecting the variation in color hue and intensities. Those values are remapped on the grid as circles with radius domains that corresponds to the exact range of temperatures registered on the thermal camera. Now you can dispatch the points and group the hottest and coldest spots and either select any given point to tag its precise temperature value. In this stage, I started looking into possible applications for this technique. So I thought maybe reviving the abandoned LAX theme building could be a smart idea, by basically installing an interactive screen on the existing outer circular wall. This installation will transform the skin of the building into an entertaining public space where it calls for people's interaction. It's a giant touchpad that reads the thermal traces and haptic feedback of people and triggers the rotation of the modular units. The cells in this prototype is a squarish metallic unit that deflects around its axis, based on the intensity of heat. Thus, the facade is morphed into a series of thermal portraits and panels based on the user's interaction pattern. Now we arrive to the fourth stage, synthesis. In the synthesis stage, the studio culminates into a comprehensive project. I found Dubai Expo is a convenient vehicle to examine my design methodology and to test out the tools and techniques I've been exploring in the preceding stages. Also, the typology of the project fits well with the objectives and the vision of the studio. In the post-pandemic world, the long-awaited Expo 2020 is rescheduled to run from October 2021 to March 2022. challenging times and a delay that could potentially bring new opportunities for engagement and contribution. Granting myself as the studio instructor and performing student the possibility of taking part of such a global mega event. An event that will definitely reshape the exposition industry and rechannel its spotlight to the principles of solidarity and humanity's resilience. It's really intriguing to examine the new norms of virtual participation. It's really intriguing to examine the new norms of virtual participation in event planning when the world reconvenes at Expo 2020 in 2021. This might sound self-contradictory, but it continues to retain its brand name as a statement that only with hope we can safely navigate through unpredictable circumstances. The Expo, which was established as a platform for cultural diversity, is also turning into an extraterritorial floor for drawing lessons from the pandemic. It's worth mentioning that the Expo is the first of its kind in the MENA and South Asia regions in terms of its magnitude. It hosts 192 countries and multinational enterprises. The Expo features iconic pavilions from 66 countries and 7 continents. However, Egypt is not in that list, so I believe it's a great opportunity to step in and address the distorted image of the country through a pavilion that doesn't only communicate to our past and present, but also speaks to our hopes for a greener future. In light of the Expo's vision to manifest values and themes that are truthful to our times, in my proposal I'm aiming to underscore the pressing priorities that we as humanity should be advocating for, yet from a peculiar cultural standpoint. My intervention is not merely an embodiment of our collective ambition to interact, but also a manifestation of the intangible ecological crisis. The first theme incorporated in my pavilion is mobility, where one steps into the phygital realm of signals and big data. Another theme is sustainability, where I intend to visualize the imperceptible qualities of our physical world and simulate the ramifications of our behavior on the ambient environment. The pavilion is designed to express the concepts of reminiscence, mutual interaction, immersive embodiment, and dynamism. So the design space demands an embodied presence from their user while simultaneously demanding participation from the built environment. The Egyptian pavilion is chosen to be positioned in the reception zone of the project, providing maximum exposure and engagement with the public. In return, the message could be delivered to as many visitors as possible. Moving on to the form generation, we start off by the design thermal image that is ran through computational engines to dissect its makeup and manipulate its representation. Each point is elevated based on the temperature value it carries. Then I interpolated the curve and then rebuilt it to create those ribs illustrated in diagram number 3. Now the thermal imprint is sculptured and lofted for further operations. As you can see, the form is further optimized by creating a mesh surface. This brings endless alternatives depending on the nature of the input fed into the thermal image sampler on Grasshopper. It also depends on the heat detection palette you are applying. Then I compute a new mesh with quad faces as shown on those diagrams. Now you can adjust the profile and the openings of the mesh surfaces. Then I inserted a new parametric surface below the frame that acts as the dynamic element of the whole structure. Next, I arrived to these fluid forms that opened up multiple possibilities and alternatives. The proposal strives to feature distinct topographic and ecological characteristics of some regions across Egypt. It brings to the surface unfamiliar modalities of representing the country. The base for the miniature environments is actually stitched with multiple echo fabrics, as illustrated, that seamlessly blend and dissolve into it, creating ecological diversity and richness to the whole space. In the following samples, the contour lines are filtered to eliminate all interrupted elevations and to select the most habitable surface among them. The constructed synthetic terrain is primarily derived from the friction and interlocking of water and land as shown in the ortho image of Lake Nasser in Egypt. From an aerial perspective, it was intended to create a resemblance with everyday objects and domestic landscapes that are both culturally and geographically tailored to Egypt. Firstly, we need to know that the aquafabric is a fluid canvas molded by the forces of heat. The form is generated through the translation of data extracted from the flat thermal painting into a form that communicates certain spatial qualities but in the third dimension. Then a uniform contour surface slides to fill the depression of the terrain to formulate an elevated flattened valley, making it a navigable platform to occupy. Metaphorically speaking, the hanging thermal ceiling symbolizes the atmospheric layer of Earth, which is quite delicate and influenced by our heat emission. Likewise, the feature installation is a thermosensitive skin that responds to visitors' thermal footprint by tracing, capturing, and mapping it using fixed thermal imaging camera systems. Then the hollowed frame canopy caps the building envelope and acts as a shield for the internal constituents of this artificial ecosystem. Lastly, the porous sky canopy is treated with solar panels to regulate natural illumination. Each panel is implanted with a different angle to harvest solar energy that powers the pavilion. The whole solar system resembles the shimmering leaves motifs on a rippling water surface. The proposal serves as a dynamic catalyst, where the transitional flux of the body can dictate the spatial qualities and configuration of the suspended shell. The ephemerality of the body motion and the permanency of architecture are fused together to formulate an animated scenery that communicates rhythm and unity of flow. One can say that the project operates as an experiential therapy that redefines the role of the user to be an integral subject of the space. The spatial layering of the pavilion resembles that of Earth. This superimposition, however, is consolidated in a coherent whole that holds multiple geographic, cultural, and ecological references within its premises. It animates a synthetic environment to evoke an immersive virtual experience for the spectator. The ecological balance hangs in the equilibrium we establish through the responsible measures we undertake. Thus, the multifaceted structure encapsulates this interconnectedness between the human and the environment. It's a time-lapse simulation of the rapid pace of degradation and alteration of our habitat. Likewise, it's a call for speeding up the enactment of policies and procedures that could help preserve the only planet we have got. Mark Hansen states that space becomes wearable when embodied affectivity becomes the operator of spacing. Accordingly, architecture cannot be disjointed from its fundamental correlation with embodiment. For this, one can activate the pavilion surfaces, leading the observer to the realization that she or he is an active player and author of the space or environment. This sensory simulation exposes the occupant to a variability of perceptual signals that translates the traces of ephemeral gestures into architecture. Likewise, the complications of our industrial activities, for instance, can provoke irrecoverable outcomes despite the absence of their discernible evidence to the few. The design highlights the interplay between body and space by the means of machine vision. In this case, it will be the motion detectors and the thermal sensing systems. The aim is to blur the interface between them and transform the viewer from being a passive receiver to a world builder, where the environment is crafted around the rhythm of the body. This brings us back to our need to articulate our practices to create a more stabilized environment. The suspended thermal cloud constitutes of series of triangular cells that constantly change in color and vertical position depending on the registered temperature value. The intent from this ever-changing thermal envelope is to make spectators consciously aware of the principle of cause and effect. It's analogous demonstration of the causality of climate change that can directly be regulated through our actions. On the ground floor, visitors can interact with the luminous structure to alter its projection mapping as they desire. Also, on the upper level, the color gradient of the thermal chandelier is determined by people's occupancy of space and the amount of joules emitted. One can witness the hybrid landscapes below the podium, as well as interact with the horizontal screen overhead. The ambience of the whole hall is modified based on the heat capacity of the space and its projected chroma. Also, the overall optical experience is enhanced by the tactility of the floating mist. I can assert that this pavilion is an environmental memorial that aspires to awaken humanity from its deep sleep by foregrounding the vulnerability of our environment. However, it opts for this goal without actually screaming. Instead, it mesmerizes the audience to win their attention. This can only be accomplished through the power of rendering the invisible visible. Finally, this studio leveraged the marriage of architecture and digital diagnostic toolkits by enlisting a wide spectrum of immersive media. Besides the fact that students will be equipped and familiarized with some cutting-edge technologies, this studio empowers them to convey and narrate their cause in an unconventional fashion. It enables them to unravel the complexities of such agencies of design. I believe that the appropriation of these superhuman receptors in architecture would yield unparalleled outcomes that go beyond what these media were set up for. Finally, all of the adopted procedures in capturing the spatial and temporal qualities of a body in space enable us to infiltrate the inaccessible fortress of the natural and built environment. In conclusion, the studio warns students the methodological approach needed to mold and visualize a world that is crafted around the temporariness of motion in space in the form of participatory narrative with the assistance of artificial perception. This concludes my vertical studio proposal, so please feel free to share your feedback. Thank you.
Okay. Mohammed, if you ever have to do like a lottery presentation, make sure it's shorter than that, okay?
Yeah.
So Mohammed, can you clarify a little bit the connection between the sensory toolkit? The first part of the presentation you outlined, it really seemed clear that that was a studio. And then there was this sort of break in the design of this pavilion. Is this part of, is that the part of the assignment for the studio? Because you were speaking about it as my intervention, my pavilion. It was very much a personal project. And I'm just curious, I didn't quite understand how that project fits into the studio proposal. Maybe you can.
Yeah, it's not personal. I'm just trying to simulate my, you know, like me performing as a student, but I didn't mean it like literally. But for the last stage, which is synthesis, I'm trying to act. So the first stage, as I said, was signalization, or it's all about exploration with the sensory kit and all of the apparatuses and so on. But and then I try to encourage students to start like translating these kind of registered images into data that could generate eventually design and like form and architecture, which happens gradually throughout the timeline of the studio.
So basically you were shifting voice between, so the first part of it was presented like behind the scenes in, like this is a review situation, you're laying out a pedagogical model, and then you shifted gears to almost like this is a proposal. See, I didn't understand you were coming.
Yeah, sorry. The whole flow of the studio is with the same tone. I'm just in the last part because it's very like, you know, it's very not personal, but it's very it varies from one student to the other. So it's something it's not like generic. So I had to kind of act and perform as a student presenting one of the possible designs that could be derived as an outcome of this studio. So that's why I changed, like I shifted my tone a little bit when I talked about the synthesis. But it's still part of the whole process, which starts with signalization, which is all about exploration, and then moving on to translation, the thermal paintings, and translating it into form and design, till the last stage, which is all about like building an actual architecture from these signalized tools. So yeah, so the shift in the tone was just like me performing something that's very special to my own proposal for like a possible outcome.
I guess I should seed this a little bit with some of the motivations here, because there was a lot to take in there. I think Mohammed's a Fulbright scholar coming from Cairo, and he's obligated to return, you know, so he's facing the prospect of teaching back in the kind of educational architectural milieu he's from. And one of the things, sorry, I guess this is going to be public now, Mohammed, okay, but I think he's very interested in trying to figure out how to loosen up a kind of creeping conservatism in the culture he's from. So the gambit is to use these instruments as a way to have his students see the world in another way, just to make the argument that the world might not be the way you think it is. And then it would go on, you know. Now, the debate here throughout the summer between he and I is, well, once you loosen them up, now you're getting into like parametric work and Grasshopper, and for many of us is the architecture of late 90s, maybe even more recently, but I don't know, like somehow conversations seem to have moved a bit, you know, with the formal discourse of digital geometry. So like, to what degree are you really opening up a perception of other ways of being? Or is this just a kind of overturning of one regime for the incorporation of another? And isn't there some kind of colonialist discourse here that troubles us? You know, how much of this is Egypt, and to what degree can you actually completely open up perception to other futures? Like, can you ever really do that? You know, yeah. So I just kind of wanted to lead with that, see where this conversation goes. Because I know Ferda and Theo, the two of you, well, I know you have strong feelings about this, and Isla, you were there the whole time, you know, writing about this. And, yeah.
Well, maybe I could start just by asking a couple of questions, because I think that outside of the framing of how we understand the particular language, the particular tools and techniques, you know, if I can sort of bracket that out for just a minute, I wanted to go back to some of the first motivations, let's say, you know, one of which was in some way the reference to dormant stimuli, right, and expanding our perceptual apparatuses. And because I'm sort of most interested in the sensory kits that amplify or transform our perception, and yet, you know, there's always questions with this. The first might be that you're dependent on technologies that already exist, as opposed to, let's say, inventing technologies that can sense and see other things. Like the thermal scanning to me is the most interesting, let's say, of the three, because the other technologies in some ways are amplifying, but they're emulating a lot of visual apparatuses that already exist, you know, and they don't really push that further. You know, people have been asking the question within our current context, like what would happen if we could actually see COVID, right? You know, how would that change our physical environment? What would happen if we could see the actual effects on our environment? You know, if we could see the acidification of the oceans, or if we could see carbon dioxide in the air, you know, or it might have to do with different scales of perception that actually change the way that we might think about architecture. So the first, I think, has to do with the kinds of the choices, let's say, that are part of the sensory kit, because I think that's a really interesting approach to begin with. And then the second part for me has to do with the methods of transcoding, you know, how we're transcoding that information, because I think the methods that you're using, you know, they're familiar methods to us, right? You know, taking a certain degree or a kind of intensity and translating that into a dimension, you know, or translating that into a degree of motion, etc. And those are the things that I wanted to kind of push, because as soon as you start to place this within the context of Egypt, and you're thinking about it in relation to the environment, you know, for me, one of the most radical things that could happen within the context of let's say being in Cairo in relation to the temperature is not living in a world that is uniformly climatized in such a way that it eliminates, you know, the environment that actually exists. But, you know, just stepping outside is pretty extreme. You know, do you need to see that in another register or in another form? Or do you think about how that might get amplified, the experience of that gets amplified through the architecture, rather than just controlled or transcoded, you know? I guess I'm just, I'm looking for a slightly more critical read of the things that you're taking on, because I think the things that you are taking on are really interesting, you know, but when you produce a final project, even, you know, a project that might be a beautiful project that in some way is referring to the environmental degradation, you know, it's always a question, right? Like what the project is intended to do. But from the curricular standpoint, for me, it's really about the methods, you know, the things that you are choosing and the methods that you set up as part of the process, because I think that's really interesting. You know, I love the thermal painting piece, you know, and it's more the question of how that starts to translate architecturally in my mind.
I agree with everything Ayla has said, and also what David has said. So I will not necessarily talk about the finalized formal expression in that regard. It's just one other issue that I think is really an important and interesting one is the expo itself. In some ways, I think it's a curious choice because it has such a history of what I would call a kind of positivistic, almost scientism translated into building, and where, you know, we all come together and we have this sort of celebration, and each of these pavilions is sort of like meant to be, you know, some kind of, either in terms of technology or in terms of environment, you know, kind of a prime example how the world will pull itself up out of its mess. And I think we are realizing it's not going to be that, right? We're realizing it doesn't work that way. And at some point, these sort of exhibitions in particular become more part of the problem than part of the solution, at least as far as I'm concerned, because they sort of regurgitate a certain belief in the ingenuity of the sort of pavilion in some way. But it's beautiful and super interesting history. But asking going forward, I wonder if that's where you want to sort of position your architectural investigation as a synthesis. I would sort of, I would wonder about that. I also think I'm really sympathetic how you work through your project, by the way. And but I also think maybe, and this is similar or related to what I already, I guess, tried to say, is even the word synthesis and translation comes with a certain apparatus of thought attached to it. And it's a certain approach to a problem that will find its resolution in the synthesis and then, you know, go on from there, etc. That there is some kind of, yeah, there's some invisible logic in the way how this type of process will continuously help us to solve our problems until we get to the end of history or something. And I think all these issues sort of are being questioned rather dramatically right now by a lot of thinkers from a lot of different angles. I think we have mentioned by discussing the other project, you know, some of those notions. Theo was talking about the non-human, etc. There just seems to be an understanding of a different set of agency that we have to pay attention to and have a certain awareness about. And I think your beginning of the project is totally in line with that. And I just like, I really like how you start out with that box. And, you know, here's my sensory apparatus, and I take it into the world, and it's an extension of my own, you know, sensibility into machines, and through the machines there's a translation. But of course, the machines still mimic reality in the way how my own perceptive organs see reality, right? There are all kinds of interesting things that are happening there. So that to me is a really interesting beginning. But by going into translation and synthesis, you kind of put a cap on the exploration rather quickly. And it ends up being a pavilion of some sort, and the project kind of ceases. And I think you should focus on the space between phase 1 and phase 2. Because I think that's where a lot of new types of observations can be made. And that's where, let's say, machine vision versus other types of visions already force you to think more hybrid and think in ways that where it's no longer necessary to synthesize, because these things already are synthesized, right? I mean, synthesis really, I mean, at least in the Hegelian sense, is, you know, you have one thing, you have another contradictory thing, and you find a way of like communicating them on a higher level. But what if these things already are completely intermeshed in a way that, you know, you have to think differently from the get-go? And I would say that that is the case. And I think in a way your project to a large part to me is about that. You begin with it, but then you sort of fall into a trajectory that I think is more about what we already know rather than exploring the thing that would have to follow the rigor of your own investigation. So I mean, I like the provocation of it, but that would be the part I'd sort of yeah, dig a little deeper into.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, the last semester with Marcelin, it was all about like focusing on the first like 2 stages of exploration and like familiarizing myself with those tools and trying to. So the thing is, in like this interface of translating those kinds of registered data into something that's really buildable. So I kind of felt obligated to deliver some sort of, you know, like architectural like product at the end. But at the same time, I've been like trying to explore like different ways of arriving to this point of synthesis.
Well, you know, Mohammed, that's a funny kind of explanation, you know, because it is the point here where when we sit down to cook up what are we going to tell students to do, we seldom actually realize how difficult some of that might be, you know. Like I've done it. Like I thought I cooked up a great brief, gave a great presentation, everybody's on board, and then shit, you know, like what I just asked students to do is something I don't even know how to do myself, you know. And if I sat down to do it, like I would have a lot of problematic things to have to deal with, you know. So I think I hope you got that out of this. You know, it's a real opportunity to see like what you're actually asking people to do, like use these new instruments, see another world, now design a new architecture. It's like, wait a minute, that's pretty tough, you know. You know, but beyond that, maybe I mean, leaving aside your performance for a second, I mean, just in general for our general discourse, I think this is a crucial, you know, topic, you know, that's obsessed us, I think, for 30 years, probably longer, but I think I entered in it like in the 90s when there was this real hope that digitization, virtualization is a kind of entry point into that weird reserve where the new comes from. You know, now we have an instrument for accessing that plane of immanence, and this is why we're all reading Deleuze at the time, you know. But then, like, we can dumb down this question a little bit. Where does that new come from? Where does the future come from? Does it come from some invisible reserve? Or does it come from the things we already have because we don't see and understand all of what we already have? You know, and for me, this is the real philosophical debate, which is pretty esoteric, but on some level it's quite simple. You know, where does that novelty come from? You know, and what is this thing that we're calling progress? There's a geopolitics, of course, to this, right? Because the developing world has been struggling to modernize and participate in the future, you know, and there's been a kind of grasping at technology. We need some of that. Let's get us some grasshopper or fabrication machines on and on. But in the end, what's motivating this is a kind of grasping at the future, you know, and the promise of that future, and which I think is very much up for debate, where that comes from. Or if it's simply a Western invention too.
I guess if I can participate a bit. I mean, the conversation is interesting, and I think a lot of the value judgment comes to where you put your emphasis on. I mean, for example, I think there is a distinction between tools and, let's say, technique as a way of translation. So we may have familiar techniques, but actually the data itself doesn't have a one-to-one correlation with how you transcode it or translate it. And I think if it does, like, for example, like the caricatures of a grasshopper building or whatever people talk about, it's because actually it has nothing to do with tool, and it has to do with just a very generic affordance of just using something familiar with a very finite outcome already in mind. And I think when it comes to some of the things that you've talked about, the things that I think, it seems like you want to assert that architecture can be a participant. It could be part of the answer, or architecture is the answer. And I think even regardless of where you sit on that line, for example, when Ferda is talking about the history of pavilions, if we look at what mechanisms we have in architecture to prototype futures, meaning like to really test some assumptions and open them up, not necessarily just technologically, but also in terms of looking radically at different frameworks. I don't think it's a bad choice, but I think the references that you would use to somehow highlight what you mean by pavilion, I think would be important. So when you were talking about Dubai and all of that stuff, what came to mind was like the Montreal Expo, and when Buckminster Fuller set up this thing called the World Game. So for example, aside from his large pavilion, he tried to really construct a framework to really talk about the global economy, the global world, one world with all of its inhabitants, this kind of ideas of mother spaceship Earth kind of stuff. And those kind of like bigger picture attempts, you know, I think sometimes people look back at as failures, but actually they are actually really the real questions that we are kind of faced in some way, that may have not been materialized in the right way, but you see that history kind of evolves, and history is plural. So I think it's important to see how you see this as something that you're going to be able to be in conversation with your students. So the other part that you talked about was about ambience, and you showed two examples. One was Team Lab and one Whole for Lyson, or James Terrell, this kind of work. And that's one definition of ambience. But a lot of the tools that you're using also reinforce the status of the image. So for example, I'll show my age. I reject all aspects of image. I always find like the idea of representation really problematic. Though I know it's a necessary evil and it's part of everything that we do, the attempt in some way to spatialize things is to try to move away from image as being the translation or the synthesis. And you see it a lot with a lot of AI techniques. For example, what we're doing is reverting back to the pixel or the voxel as being the information that we're going to somehow extract and spatialize. And it goes back actually to all of the kind of software techniques that we may know. If it's ZBrush, if it's whatever, you know, image mapping and stuff like that, bump maps. So I mean, like in some strange way, like knowing that there is this kind of technique world that has operated in architecture, your role, I think, setting up a studio or whatever is to try to find a methodology that challenges that. You know that that's part of teaching because students don't have access to that if they never did. So if some of us get jaded by seeing something, it's new to them. So novelty really resides in the audience that you're speaking to. But if you want it to be something different, meaning different for them, or resonate with some way to include other references to really bring it into something that's unique, I think you have to kind of open up the possibilities. So if you ask me, like you doing the project is almost like the blueprint of what actually is going to be expected as success. And it's not a problem. I think it's a really useful thing to do, but I would ask you to do what David does with some of his students, which is actually not know what the end goal is. Because I think at some moment, if not, then you have a very strict working methodology and it doesn't really allow for any space to really maneuver. So I would question the issue of the image as your tool of translation. What is the information you're doing? And then I would really try to situate this whole notion of what the expo is. If it's really even a physical space, I would make the argument again like it should be, because we have to reinforce space as actually a medium to interface, and that communication is different. And I just think whatever you take as a position, I think sets up, I think, your take on this, so it's not a studio of digital tools and technologies and design. So I think you have some interesting elements to it, but I would try to tease them out a little bit further. What atmosphere and environment really mean to you? Is it really solar shading and a bitmap then that gets translated? I would say like that would be maybe the 101 version you teach the students, but that would push much further than that. Or challenge them to actually see what the environment is, because that would go back to the Fuller thing, bring us all together again. If machines do have a vision, it's pretty much not the aesthetic bitmap that we're sort of utilizing right now. So if you are moving into that world of information, it would be interesting how you would do it differently. Not like MVRDV trying to do data design for housing. It would be something different, but you could learn from those different approaches. So I think it's an interesting way that David posted the questions, which is that when you return back home and you're teaching a studio, what is it that you really want to somehow construct? It's not going to happen out of one studio, but see it as a larger experiment. If you have 5 years, what's the goal that you're really trying to establish? And I think that somehow takes a little bit of the burden of trying to be successful by actually just being very deliberate and having very predefined outcomes. So I think this is the kind of game as an educator that you have to somehow balance. At least in my opinion, I shouldn't make the statement, but you should.
And this is such a poignant point, Theo, because I think many of us, we face this kind of dilemma of, does every project out of our studio more or less look the same, where we have a strong formal agenda, or does we leave it up to the students? We try to cultivate plurality. And I think the mainstream, I don't know, the common wisdom has been, the better studios are the ones that have a strong formal agenda and strong identity. I think just in the economic marketplace of the past 2 decades, it worked better, definitely. It made certain things more visible than others. But I think now we might be in a stage where we need to, and I would love to know what all of you think of this, but I think we're in a period where we need to actively cultivate plurality. And which means maybe what we see and identify as our contribution to the studio is the methodology.
Yeah, I think related maybe to that question is the question whether Muhammad's amazing kind of ability to have a a sustained argument is something that is actually enough today, if that makes sense, because this is, I was thinking as you were presenting, and maybe the low-hanging fruit for me was to kind of critique the parametric style, that you produced eventually, because I understand that there was another agenda behind that. This idea of bringing technology, bringing the image of technology into the country and kind of like starting the digital project or kind of starting that idea, But the other problem though is whether or not these kind of self-contained super coherent narratives are enough, like especially like after Donald Trump and after that kind of idea of that reality does not actually is not constituted by that thinking anymore. And I was actually interested in that strategy that you brought, and I thought maybe that was somehow the point of the studio, was to rethink the parametric project, as the project of other kind of maybe mapping coming from the signal and then getting into data and then producing the aesthetic expression that was kind of maybe what parametric project was also always trying to kind of suppress, or trying to like not talk about as or think that is not important. Because, I think that maybe the critique to parametricism that one could have is that it's actually a project of kind of a suppression of desire, It's kind of this idea of we can solve the problems through technology, you don't have to worry because all these things are interconnected in the back end. Like data connects to output connects to this sensor, everything is fine. Just let us do our job. But it turns out that actually there is a kind of an unfulfilled desire to see certain things in the world. And I thought that was an interesting way that maybe your approach can be rethought. But for that, I think you would need to drop the essentialist idea of that you are preserving some kind of quality through these translations, that actually you're working with heat, while you're actually just working with RGB data and really like to be more like a technology realist and to understand that these technologies are already framing like those problems for you, that you are not in the position to be outside somehow like trying to decipher what's happening there, because technologies are already producing the effect. They're kind of, we are far beyond the kind of initial techne, stage. Now we are in the framing stage where things are completely political. So that was maybe my idea. I thought it was really an interesting presentation. It was so kind of focused, but if you rethink that essentialism of one thing becoming the other somehow, I think it has the potential to be really like critical to the contemporary moment.
David, if I can, I think the comments are great. I don't have anything to add to that, but I want to just take your last comment, David, about the plurality of approach to a brief. And I'm wondering if, this is like a comment we've seen on different students, and I'm wondering if it's the setup of pedagogy on the last semester that asked one student to do their own syllabus, and it forces them to find out like what the best version of that would be. And if it would make more sense for one, like each 3 weeks, let's say, the whole DTP would try one of the syllabus, and then you would have that result in plurality. Because I think that it's difficult when you're asked to produce your own work and you're judged on it, that you will try to do the best version. And then we fall in that conversation of, is it a project or is it a pedagogy what you're presenting? And I think that question has come over and over, maybe less in Solidet's case, but you know, we see like a presentation of a certain idea of pedagogy and then a project.
As you know, this has been a question in the program for 3 years. So, yeah, so we'll keep that.
I think in this
Sorry,
case,
Ayla.
It's really, I think in this case, the question of, you know, Mohammed, you said architectural product, that I needed to come with an architectural product. And I think that might have been, I mean, that's so important, that decision, like, is the architectural product a building? Because that's a kind of convention in many schools where it's like, okay, the design studio, we must arrive at a building. And I would sort of challenge that, because I think the toolkit that you've put on the table, the sensory toolkit, and the whole question of signalization and how that works in architecture, I think would maybe lead us to an outcome that would not be able to resolve neatly into a buildable structure. And that's what I would love to see. Is I feel like it was maybe a little bit more of a safe choice to take it that way, but I think really questioning what the product is essential in your case. But I think you've done an amazing job, so I want to commend you on the work.
Yeah, maybe if I could just follow up a little bit on that, because first, I also think the work that you've done is amazing, and I agree with Marceline that in some ways the tools themselves and the methodology would start questioning any kind of preconceived outcome, you know, or it should, and it's really coming down to what the choices are that you make at the very beginning in this, in terms of each stage. I often think of designing a syllabus like designing, I would always say it's like designing a machine, if you can kind of think machine more broadly, as a set of methodologies. And some of those machines will stamp out the same thing. It doesn't matter what material you put in, you know, and it just based on the nature of the methodologies themselves can still stamp out a very uniform sort of set of products. And others would produce something very, very differently. And so it's a question of how you're making that machine and to what end in some ways. And this is why I'm always focused on both the media and the methods themselves, how the data or the information more broadly is interpreted, how it gets used, how it's manipulated, transformed. I'm also, you know, I'm interested in this conversation around, let's say, techniques and the idea of future and novelty, because I think this is also part of it, you know, because the techniques are the things that are going to produce a certain language, and we might be operating within shifting languages. Like, I think of this as formal dialects that get tied to specific tools, right? And yet there's, in some ways, we might overvalue this notion of uniqueness and novelty to the point that when certain products get repeated over and over again and we're familiar with them, they become cliche, and then they become a kind of crass signifier of the future, which has already become the past and is continuously being displaced by other ideas of originality or novelty. And I'm always questioning that in and of itself, the kind of, let's say, overvaluation of just the new, whatever that might mean. And instead, you know, dig down into the tools, the toolbox that you set up at the beginning, because I think you have to question, like, what is it that you want to see or experience that would be different, you know, at the outset than what already exists, than your normal perceptual apparatuses, and let that start to drive it. You know, as a kind of last comment, I remember having conversations with the head of computer science in engineering, who always referred to architectures as just users. Like, you said, you know, we don't actually create things, we're just users of all the things the technologies, the coding, the things that they produce. And I was always trying to make the argument about the kind of originality of those products. And the point was that he was thinking originality based on the kind of code and the technology, not on the products or the things that were produced. But I do think, you know, we have to go back to the question around those technologies. Like, you know, because part of the problem for me is that I see architecture as an incredibly creative field. Engineers have an incredible way of diving deep, far deeper than we do, into very specific problems, but are perhaps less creative when it comes to the thinking around the problem itself, or what's driving the push for the technology. And I'd like to see, in some ways, that condition become reversed, so that we're pushing the demands on the technologies themselves by the methods or the things that we might be producing. So, but I think they're all interesting, certainly interesting problems and questions that you've raised through this.
No, Isla, I just want to quickly pick up on the notion of novelty, a little bit how you outline it, and also get back to David's debate, if you will, about studio in terms of some kind of uniform language versus methodology. I think it's hard to also discuss something like the concept of novelty outside of history, because it's so clearly contingent on it. And so the question of novelty to me is interesting in relationship to the question of pluralism. Because let's say a kind of an age that believes in some kind of technologically motored progress has a very different definition of novelty than, let's say, an age that believes into a pluralist, you know, notion of let's say design or formal expression. And when I look back in time, it seems pretty clear to me, at least, and that's a very superficial reading, but I think there's still some truth to it, that often some kind of an technologically invested era vis-a-vis ideas of novelty, let's say classical modernism, is for very obvious reasons then followed by novelty as understood in postmodern times, as the thing that is precisely based on existing material, alienation, estrangement, reshuffling, collage, etc., versus the idea of novelty that is being produced almost ex nihilo from some kind of technological divinity that has, you know, kind of come into our possession. And I would argue, and it's interesting maybe also to hear Theo on this, I would argue that the 90s, in my case in particular, I mean, I can certainly say that was the case for me, had a strong notion of novelty as something that we can generate ex nihilo out of a technological box, right? And that was the definition of the new. And it didn't really allow for a different kind of criticality that maybe, Isla, you were also mentioning when you used the word criticality. And seeing where we are maybe for the last, I don't know, maybe now 10 to 15 years, where notions of novelty are no longer strictly bound in architecture culture with technology and efficiency of technology. Suddenly we have a whole other set of possible architectural explorations of what is the new, or is there even a new, as David said, well, maybe all we do is we are just sort of retooling, you know, the kit. And it's just in the way how we do that then we believe ourselves to be confronted with the new. I would say that we are at a time where pluralism is inescapable, David. And I don't think it does even matter if the studio in and of itself, as a 12-person boat, if you will, provides something that seems to look alike, or where each individual student has something that is based on a similar methodology but with completely different outcome. it's just a drop in the ocean. I think that boat has sailed right now, and maybe my sense almost is, given sort of proliferation of images and all those kinds of things, that maybe this time there is not going to be a back to what any type of orthodox technology-driven positivistic understanding of the new. Maybe that ship really has sailed, and then the question really is, how do we maintain any kind of sort of constituency or expertise, or do we just let that sail also? And that's just a question I'm just asking myself all the time. I have obviously no answer for it.
I think further, I would just pick up on a couple of things that you mentioned, because I think it also depends on how we somehow express some of these histories, because I think in some way new may not be the goal, but evolving and upgrading a conversation with a desire of actually trying to problematize architecture and its relevancy, I think is super important. And I think we only do that by actually continuously somehow also, I think, kind of unapologetically believe that it actually matters. So, I mean, the fact that we're having a conversation is good, but if everybody becomes a thinker, whatever this means today, that doesn't believe that architecture, which makes very specific demands, and I think to go back, because we share that history of the 90s and the digital project, a big part of the thrust of that was trying to get the stuff out of the computer. That became a goal. And that goal was not a small task, and I don't actually think that we've successfully done that. But the conversation very quickly moves. And I think there's also a disjunction between the academy, who wants to talk about criticality, and also the nature of what practice is. Because at some moment in time, I think it was much more successful when you had young educators who were also trying to create their practice, and that conflict and daily friction brought about, I think, certain innovation. I'm not sure it was innovation in the same technological framework that we would talk about in terms of startup culture, but for many of us, I think we were trying to do it in a more intelligent way. Technology didn't mean the latest technology. Technology was something very human, and it was actually really mining all forms of translation of material practice. So, I mean, I quite like the fact that Mohammed thinks that the building is an answer. I just not necessarily sure I have the same definition of building. But one thing that I think can be learned from all of that experimentation was translation of a lot of these processes into form has certain limitations. And if you want to extend that into the real time or the daily life cycle of the building, you also have to conceptualize how that goes beyond that initial translation. And I think that that is something, for example, with your sensing interests and so forth, like how do you do that in a way that actually then embeds itself and unfolds itself within, what that actually means. And that's where I think some of those cybernetic experiments, that some of that stuff in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, I'm not nostalgic by it, but I really felt that it was plural in its vision, because there were a lot of different people working on a lot of different things, and all of them were as legitimate. And in some way, we don't actually even have to agree to be pluralistic. I think we are by nature. And for example, in the context, Mohammed, that you're going to be teaching this in Egypt, it would be interesting how that information gets synthesized, what's taken, what are the references that you would look at, and just to try to understand something that's much more context specific than a kind of generalized global project, which I think was a huge mistake, to identify that that even was something advantageous, which we would have learned very easily with a kind of international style, all this kind of stuff. So I don't know if architecture is always a failure, then I think we should stop doing it. But by necessity, it's profoundly fundamental, and so is our cities and urbanism. And I think we have to be in a place where we actually believe that those things have a discipline of knowledge. Because I have the same kind of colleagues, Ayla, that from an engineering perspective used to say our code is crap, it's shit, why do you even do this? We could do this in a minute, but that's not the aim. And the goal has a complexity that's very different, but we don't speak about that. And I'm not, I think that the conversations are really rich, so what you guys are doing here is useful in terms of the discussion, as long as these conversations somehow get synthesized and then go back into the framework like Yara was talking about. Are there experiments on a year-to-year that challenges, let's say, the workflow of what happens over that year, where students are actually experimenting with each other's pedagogies? If there's a convergence, then there's an interest of a style or of a very particular outcome. If there's divergence, potentially, maybe there's something else at play. Or maybe it's just that cohort of students that are coming together. So I'm not really sure. I don't necessarily think we have to answer those questions. I think we have to be aware of them and to see where it goes. But I really think if we think of technology as gadgetry and technique, then we're destined to fail. Because I think that's what becomes tired. That's where we don't see innovation, we just see application of things. And it was the same thing with all of the open source promises and all of these other things. A lot of people that were users, very few people contributing their knowledge. So I think they can learn a lot from our mistakes, but to be honest with you, I don't feel like I'm that old. I'm feeling like I'm just starting as well. So Mohammed, I think we're still part of the same ring of characters, trying to think that buildings matter, but you may not get an opportunity. You still have to construct a vision of what this architecture is going to be. So I think it's important. It also comes down to if you feel like you have something to teach. And I don't know, when I went to the AA, the first thing I was told by the director of the program was, I have nothing to teach you. And I think that that's an important thing too, because if you're looking for a literal how to do a technique or how to do this, you don't allow yourself to ask some probably much more profound and fundamental questions, which we're all dealing with in our own kind of foray into this stuff. So I think it's an interesting conversation.
I mean, we are wrapping up, but I really like the way the conversation went here for our final bit here. Is one subtext of the program is all 5 students are from other nation states that chose to come here for this education. Recently, oh, interesting, Michael Osmond jumped back in. Perfect timing, Michael. So I started reading first through Michael Osmond's suggestion, this Chinese philosopher named Yu Kui, and I put a link to a nice shorter thing he wrote. He makes a really interesting point, I think, which is maybe an alternative to why we might be postmodern, but it's different from the kind of post-structuralist discourse we know so well. We're now past modernism because the crucial point for him is technology, is it an anthropological universal? If so, we can conclude that different nation states, communities might have a more advanced or more primitive relationship to that universal. But then that technology, the technological is somehow there for everybody. And that is kind of an enlightenment argument, right? But if it is in fact not anthropologically universal, every cosmology there then has its own technology. And then we are then left to talk about the technologies of different cosmologies. Then he coins this term cosmotechnics. I think that's a really interesting proposal, you know? So instead of seeing this, which certainly perpetuates the colonialist history to say, you go to the elite schools to get a more advanced understanding of technology. Then you return home to bring your community up to par, you know? And I think that's a deeply modern idea. And Yu Kui is, I think, absolutely right for pointing that out. And I think there may be other ways to think about what technology is relative to multiple cosmologies, you know, where no one place has a kind of more advanced access to that universal. It may not be universal at all, you know.
Hey, I'm on my bike. Sorry.
You want to say something about Ukui?
No, I just wanted to say that I thought I was impressed that you made it in here.
Yeah.
I literally just jumped off my bike.
Yeah, you gotta be careful what you tell me, man.
And then figuring out that the Yukui kind of talks to fascists on podcasts, I had no idea. So, but I just wanted to say that I also, that the thinking that you're, that also so basically he comes out of Heidegger, this guy, and he's saying that, like, look, if Heidegger says that technology is our new form of being, or is replaces what we used to call being, that we have to redefine that as what we thought was an essence, a new essence. We have to redefine that as multiple essences. And for me, that's very liberating. I worry a little bit about the incipient nationalism of it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Right? Because there's also the scary thing is just like, you know, what is that? What is it? What is a cosmotechnics if it's not an anti-cosmopolitanism? So that's all I have to say as I'm listening on my headphones from from my bicycle ride. But I have to. I love that we could do this. Talk about techniques.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm very interested in exploring this because I think I feel like our technological discourse has been a little bit stalled out, and we've kind of put it on. We shelved it. Instead, we've been looking at culture a lot more, you know, which then resulted in a kind of creeping FOMO, which many people have commented on recently. But I think it is a big question nonetheless still, and it's going to continue to endure as like the question. Technology, that is. But I think there are some other ways to maybe think about techniques and technology relative to the political circumstances that we're all too familiar with now. You know? So without having to reject it, saying, no, technology, that's just a 90s thing. No.
It doesn't.
I think that's an enduring question. It's not, that question doesn't go away, I think.
Yeah, but I think it's also that technology doesn't go back in the box. So it's once it's out there, it's about that kind of creative misuse of those intentionalities in the first place. Because I'm not sure that what we mean by technology is something that's so shared. I would somehow refute that from the beginning, like the premise that somehow that means something. But anyway, I think the conversation is interesting. I think it's up to the students to make use of it, because I think otherwise it's kind of like, I don't know, it reinforces that language has limitations, if you want me to be honest from my side, because some of the discourses can get trapped in things that in some sense don't necessarily see architecture as a participant, like architecture as building or architecture as city, and it's a curious moment for I think where we're going with all of this. If it is a collective project, otherwise it'll splinter off into little things, which it has done. But I think the bigger picture of all of this is actually we believe that it matters. So we're trying to figure out a way forward.
Okay, so I'm gonna bow out now as just a studio instructor for the summer, and I'm gonna hand it off to Marceline for some final words since she is the program.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for this amazing discussion. I think it's been a fantastic culmination to the work that's been going on over the 3 semesters. I think some of the really important points that are coming up about feedback and how some of the models that we've implemented, that David and I set up in the studios, how they might begin to inform the future pedagogies. I know right now, the current incoming class, we've already had a meeting where we just started to talk about the impact of this remote learning and how that's going to change pedagogy fundamentally. Also the idea, again, I think, Mohammed bringing up this idea of architectural product. Like, what is that today? What constitutes architectural knowledge? What is the end game? The connection between practice and education, that those models of practice are really changing. I mean, when I went to school, the idea was that everybody would start their own small office and have some connection to academia. And I think this came up in the conversation as well about how we as educators use academia to try things out that we might be working on in our own practice, in small installations, things like that. I think everything is really changing quite rapidly now. And I really encourage all the students in the current class to actually take these questions on further and really push it. Don't be afraid to go too far with it. I think really that's the message I'm getting today, is you need to just be really fearless and go out and implement these pedagogical models and raise these questions and pose possible ways forward. And I just think that I'm so happy with the discussion and the our guests today, really amazing people that bring these conversations onto the table. And I just want to thank David as well for really for inventing this program. It's so needed more than ever, I think. So I look forward to our next session next week with Emil and Roshanak. Thanks, everyone.
Great.
Thank you, everyone. So nice seeing all your faces.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being generous with the time and being with us today.
It was great. It's really, really fun.
Great to see you.
Afternoon conversation.
Great to see you as well.
Good to see you.
Thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
Later, see you.
Okay, the small team.
Congratulations.
Nice
I have to go to another meeting, but
yeah, we
Go.
know.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you,
I
Marcel.
have,
Thank you, David.
I think 5 more hours of Zoom still today. Oh, God.
I can't
Shoot me
believe it,
now.
David.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
David.
See you at 7:30, David.
Yeah. I'll see you later tonight. Yeah.
Okay, David.